Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm talking with John Russon. John holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Toronto. He's a professor and philosopher and has written numerous books. He's written 3 books on Hegel, and he's written his own work. His first book is Human Experience. He's also written Bearing Witness to Epiphany. Third book, Sites of Exposure, and the fourth book, Adult Life. In this episode, we talk about all of those books, and we focus on the philosophies of Hegel, Heidegger, and Merleau-Ponty. It will come as no surprise that I'm very favorable to Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, and so I was really excited to talk with John about their philosophies in depth. We start the conversation by talking about Hegel. I have not talked about Hegel too much on the podcast, and so I wanted to get somebody on here that knows a few things about him. John obviously has, well published on Hegel, and so we start out with an overview of Hegel's philosophy. We talk about the differences between intersubjective and interpersonal. Then we use an example of sexual intimacy to explain some of Hegel's points about recognition, objective-subjective components, and a few other things. We talk about how Hegel's philosophy influenced Marxism in terms of individuality and some of the mixed lessons from the French Revolution. We talk about how one can, understand if, institutions or individuals within institutions are oppressive or malevolent, and that kind of push-pull dynamic that continues to go on in debates. And then we transition to Heidegger, and we give a discussion of Heidegger's Dasein. We talk about the authenticity and inauthenticity of Dasein, and then we talk about worldhood, Heidegger's notion of the world and the 4 different types of world. We then switch to Merleau-Ponty and talk about his view of perception. We also talk about Gestalt psychology versus Gestalt therapy and some of Merleau-Ponty's object-subject background in perception and his contribution. We talk about Merleau-Ponty's ideas about embodiment, which was huge for his philosophy. And we end the conversation talking about the phenomenology of space and how that's applied more recently. This is a long episode. It's one of my longer ones, which I'm always thrilled to do. I think this episode is about 3 hours. So, and I really have to say that the 3 hours were really invigorating, and I wanted to keep going, but I wanted to also be mindful of listeners' patience and stamina as well. John is not only a really smart guy, I mean, you can tell from the conversation, and he just knows how to maneuver in and out of these topics, but genuinely very nice. I mean, he is a very nice person, and we got on well together, and I really enjoyed every minute of the conversation. And now I bring you John Russon. I'm here with John Russon. John, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and going to get into some of these great thinkers and your own original work. So I'm excited about this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm eager to talk.
Yeah, that's great. So just real quick, just kind of give us your kind of potted biography, just kind of your who you are, what you do, what you study, and anything you're currently working on, any projects, things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I've been a university teacher for about 30 years. And I've taught at a variety of places. I started off, I had a research fellowship at Harvard, and then I taught at Acadia University in Canada. Then I taught at Penn State University in the United States. When that was actually pretty exciting, because at that time it was kind of the flagship department for European philosophy. So it was a pretty exciting place to be. Mm-hmm. I taught at the University of Toronto for about a year or two. And then for the last 15 years, roughly, I've been teaching at the University of Guelph, outside Toronto. So I've been in the university a long time. most of that time, like I'm really excited about teaching philosophy, because I actually believe, I don't think of philosophy as about, ideas in the sense of intellectual entertainment. I think of philosophy as, how teaching us how to see what's going on in our lives. And so I think of philosophy as the most vibrant and exciting study. And so I love teaching because I love being involved with people who are trying to figure out their lives, trying to figure out the world. And I think, the history of philosophy has such great resources. So I've been doing that, and I've been writing books. I've written, I think, about 8 books now, in some books on specific philosophers, but I've been trying to write books that are my own attempt to synthesize some of these great ideas and use them to interpret our experience. Mm-hmm. And that's most of me. The other, on the side, I play a little guitar. So mm-hmm. That's a big part of what I like. I like writing music, and I have a little jazz band. We recorded a couple of records.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. I'm going to say, I'm assuming your PhD is in philosophy. Is that correct?
Yeah, from the University of Toronto.
Okay, nice. I like the way you said that, because it's one of those things where I also agree. Most people, they'll think of philosophy as these kind of really big abstract ideas. And then, it's like, well, these are people philosophizing, how does this have any impact or relevance? And so I totally agree with you on that.
Yep.
And yeah, I think you have is it a 3 or 4 part series of your own original stuff? Yeah. So I know it's Human Experience is the first one, and then there's 1 or 2 in the middle.
There's another one in the middle called Bearing Witness to Epiphany. Uh-huh. And then the final one is Adult Life. And I have a 4th book that's not actually part of that series. Like those 3 books I kind of imagined sort of charting out issues that happen over the course of a person's life. Uh-huh. I have another book called Sites of Exposure, which has the same kind of philosophical orientation, but it's much more about art, politics, and religion.
So this is kind of your trilogy, and then you have exactly. the standalone. Great. Yeah. And kind of what you said, and I've read the first and the third one, and it does, I've read a lot of, similar philosophers, and it really is a nice way of synthesizing, but not watering down a lot of the big ideas. And so if people don't want to read 500 pages of Being in Time, they can get some of the major tenets of those ideas and other ones in your book. So they're great. I really enjoy them. They're great.
Thank you.
Okay, so I want to start off by talking about Hegel.
Sure.
I have not had a lot of Hegel on the podcast. I've done a lot of Heidegger, a handful of Nietzsche, but I've been wanting to talk about Hegel. Phenomenology of Spirit is probably his biggest work.
Yeah.
And it is a tough read. Yep. I've read it a few times. It's a tough read. But go ahead.
I was just going to say, I've written 3 books on it.
Yeah, no, so I haven't had a chance to read your books on it. So I was like, I know the perfect person to talk about Hegel with. And I've actually had a few people ask me like, when are you going to talk about Hegel? And I was like, I'd really like to. I just got to find the right person. So do your worst. Give us the kind of overview of his philosophy and where he sits in the timeline, and we can just get into it.
Okay. Obviously, it's a huge, Hegel's philosophy is huge. It's about everything. Mm-hmm. And so I won't obviously try to say everything, but I'll try to tell you what I think are the sort of core ideas, but especially the core ideas that I think make it exciting and make it really pertinent to our lives. Mm-hmm. And I think if you grasp these ideas, then you can get anything from his philosophy. You can go from these to anything.
Great.
And so the Phenomenology of Spirit was written, I think, in 1807. I think that's when he published it. So it's 200 years ago. But if you study contemporary European philosophy, when you read Hegel from 200 years ago, like you're reading really when those kind of contemporary ideas first hit the stage. Mm-hmm. So Hegel is kind of the guy who brought onto the world stage the kinds of things people have now been thinking about for basically 200 years and developing in movements like Marxism, existentialism, mm-hmm. psychoanalysis, all kinds of things. Yeah. And I think the most important idea to understand for understanding what Hegel is what Hegel is doing is the word in the title of his book, Phenomenology of Spirit, is the word phenomenology. So there's a big 20th century movement called phenomenology, which we're obviously going to go on to talk about.
Yeah.
But Hegel's book has that same word in the title, and it means more. He means more or less the same thing that the 20th century guys mean. It's a little bit different, but basically what he's doing in his philosophy is he's asking what's going on when we have a certain kind of experience. So we have lots of experience. Like you describe your experience like I'm walking down the street, or I see a thing, or I feel angry, or I have to vote, right? These are all experiences. And, we go through these experiences all the time, but we tend just to be sort of drawn along by what's happening, often without really grasping what it means that we experience this situation as friendship, or that we experience this situation as a moment to vote or something like that. So anyway, so he tries to analyze what it is to have these experiences. And one of the main things he shows, so that would say that's the first point, that what he's doing is this kind of analysis of our experience. One of the main things he shows is that things we take to be just sort of static and fixed are often processes. And I'll give you a simple example of that. Seeing a thing, like that seems like the most obvious thing in the world. You open your eyes, you see a thing there. So we often take it that the perception of a thing is just, it's kind of like a fixed fact. You flip a switch or something like that. But one of the things he does is analyze what actually goes on when we see a thing. And he shows that the experience of seeing a thing actually has different phases. On the one hand, we see a thing as something that's just a kind of a thing kind of all by itself.
Yeah.
There's another phase where you notice it as having a bunch of properties, like it's red or thick or beside that other thing and so on. And indeed, often you might see something that interests you and you might say to your friend, look at that thing, right? And it's only when your friend asks you which one that you have to say, oh, the green one beside the tree or something. And one of the things that Hegel brings out through his very careful analysis is that your attitude actually shifted when you went from seeing one thing to seeing a whole bunch of properties. I won't try to bring out all the significance of that, but his point is to show that what we often take to be a simple fact is actually a process that goes through different stages, and often those stages reveal that we have sort of contradictory ideas about what we're doing. And so, if you think of the familiar kind of idea that you could objectify a person, right? And so the difference between someone treating you as a subject and someone treating you as an object,
right?
And this point about the thing is kind of like that. Like he's trying to show, like on the one hand, you treat it this way, almost like it's a subject. On the other hand, you treat it this way, almost like it's an object. It's not exactly parallel, but he tries to show that we shift through these perspectives. And anyway, that's a kind of thing he does all over the place, is show us that our experience that we take to be simple is actually a process of moving through contradictory ways, inherently contradictory ways of making sense of our situations. And the place where that, you might not care that much about whether there's a inherent contradiction in the way you construe things. That might not seem like a big deal. But the place that really matters is in our dealings with other people, whether at the individual level or at the social and political level. Certainly. And indeed, I just said, you can shift from treating a person as a subject to treating a person as an object. And that would be a way that you could have two pretty opposed views about what a person is. And it kind of matters which one you're doing. And so one of the things he might show is that in certain kinds of our experience, we kind of illicitly move back and forth between those two. And I'll talk about that exact thing. So the first idea I wanted to get to was describing our experience. The second one was seeing these experiences as processes that have contradictions. And then the third thing I would take from Hegel is the idea that in our relations with other people, the primary thing that is at stake is whether we're being recognized as subjects. And that I think is the the most powerful idea that his phenomenology of spirit revolves around is a very, very detailed and rich studies of how in our behavior with respect to other people, we do or don't act in a way that recognizes the person we're dealing with as a subject, or recognizes that we are ourselves subjects. And so he has this very famous analysis of it's often called the master-slave dialectic. He has the analysis of a relationship of, somebody who has a slave. And he works out, what kind of attitude you have to the other person to treat that person as a slave, and equally, what attitude you have to have towards yourself to construe yourself as a slave or to construe that person as your master. Mm-hmm. And one of the really powerful things Hegel shows is that there's an inescapable contradiction in treating someone as a slave, because basically you have to treat them simultaneously as being a person and not being a person. You have to treat them as free and not free at the same time. And of course, you can't both be free and not free at the same time. But the very attitude of slavery, of enslaving someone, on the one hand, recognizes the person to be free because you think this is the kind of person who can understand my orders. This is a person who can do things. If I say, go make me dinner, this person can understand that and go make dinner, So you have to treat this person as having the capacities that are uniquely available to free beings. But then at the same time, you say, but you're not actually a free person. You're not actually a human being. You're some kind of animal. So it's okay for me to treat you as if you're my possession, right? So you, on the one hand, have to recognize the person as a subject, as a free being, and on the other hand, act in a way that precisely denies that recognition. So that's an example of how Hegel shows that, the attitude of having a slave has a contradiction in it. And I talked before about processes. What he tries to show is that if you can sort of, kind of as I just did here, like giving a person an order, like you have to move through first treating a person this way, then treating a person this way, and so on. And he tries to work out the way that the actual process of interacting with this person you're calling your slave, will be a process in which you go through different steps that contradict each other and thereby reveal that there's a problem in your attitude. So that's the relationship of slavery, which is very important. I mean, slavery has been a huge and horrible thing in human history, mm-hmm. but presumably it doesn't characterize what's going on with most of us most of the time with our friends. But there are nonetheless powerful lessons that come from that, right? There are ways that in dealing with our children, our friends, our employees, our love partners, we can shift from one attitude to another in ways that sort of without ever actually owning up to it are sort of implicitly dominating or denying the other person's subjectivity or denying the other person's freedom, failing to recognize about the other person, basically their subjectivity and so on. Anyway, that's the thing then that Hegel, I think, especially powerfully does in the Phenomenology, is bring out that idea that what is at stake in all of our interpersonal relations, first and foremost, is this issue of recognizing. Are we recognizing and being recognized as subjects? And he does a pretty powerful job of sort of opening up this idea that we often have subtle and unacknowledged ways of not recognizing the other person properly. And so that then can spawn all kinds of rich psychological and ethical reflections on interpersonal life. And then that also becomes the basis for his political philosophy, because the question there is, in a system of laws and in a system of institutions, similarly, do these institutions reflect a recognition, an honest recognition of the freedom and the subjectivity of the people for whom they are institutions, and so on? Anyway, so that I think that's my quick potted version of what Hegel's about and what you get from the Phenomenology of Spirit. And I think it's one of the richest and most powerful books human history has ever produced. So it's a great one. Oh, certainly. And very hard.
It's very hard. It's very powerful, and it has much influence. So let me go back to the first thing you said.
Sure.
So if I have here, of course, listeners can't see this, but for the sake of argument, I have a water bottle and a cup filled with coffee.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Now, if I have these two things and I tell you, yes, you see the thing, the first question is going to be, well, which one?
Right.
Right. Now, in this case, so let's say it's the cup, right? And I say, yes, you see the cup. And you say, automatically, the idea of what's going on is there are multiple things going on at the same time in different dimensions. Namely, I would see myself as the subject, right? I'm the one that's authoring this, the words coming out of my mouth. I'm the one that's saying to look at the object. And then I'm also doing that with another person that also has subject-object types of relations. And so in what you were saying on I think the first point was that on one level, there's what is you didn't say this clearly, explicitly, but that you're trying to understand, well, first, what is the object that another person is stating? And then what is the intentions, right? Of, well, what is, once I make a discrimination in my mind of, is it the water bottle or is it the cup? Then you're trying to say, okay, well, what about that? That whole process is an experience, which is we have an objective and a subjective way of understanding between two different beings, both trying to have, I guess you could say, a shared experience is maybe a way of saying that. And Hegel was trying to detail and give a kind of, I always think of Hegel, I think Nietzsche said this too, of, he created the best structure, right? He created the best system of how to understand things. And because he allows for some aspects to be malleable or flexible, right? And so you're able to say, okay, well, here I'm talking about the cup filled with coffee. Now, that whole process is an experience. How you're describing that is going to be described based on who the subject is and what are the objects. But the totality of all of that is an experience. Yeah. The way we talk about it in details is usually this duality or polarity, right, of this objective subjective. And Hegel was one of the first, I would say, at least in a creative system, of trying to understand those kind of polarities, but then to kind of say, well, how do we understand both of those subsumed into what we call lived or shared experience? Yeah. More in a more granular way, I think Sartre talks about this later, and Merleau-Ponty as well, which is, okay, well, there are things about the cup, right? So again, listeners can't see my cup. It's a orangish, reddish hue. I don't know what color this is. And on the outside, and there's a handle, small handle. It's a very small cup. And you can tell the details, and you can tell maybe it's kind of got some chips on here and, whatever, right? It's painted, whatever. But you don't know what's on the other side of the cup. Right. Right. You have a type of mental structure, right? Well, if it looks like this on this side, then it's going to look like this on the same side based on a prior. What you don't know is that on the other side, right, there's some design. It's got a bird on it. Yeah. Now, you wouldn't know that. You wouldn't be able to know that. But you could know the kind of contours of the object. You can get the gestalt of it. You can understand that what it is of what we call a cup is all of these parts together. But in actuality, there is also the experience of, well, I'm holding it, there's something in it, it has weight, it has volume, it has all these things. And that's also part of the experience. Now, we're not having this in the same room, but I'm telling you all these things and you have some idea of it. All of these things, with my very laborious example, is that what Hegel was trying to show? Yeah. All of these parts are having an experience. It's not simply objective, subjective. It is, and maybe with things or with objects, we could say, yes, that's a tree, that's a cup, that's a car. These are names that we give these objects. But it becomes much more difficult when you're talking about other humans. But his whole enterprise was, how do we understand a system of objects and subjects, but then how do we understand the collective experience that encompass all those things? Am I capturing this right, or am I off on this?
I think that is right. Let me quickly say sort of my version of that, and then add one thing. Mm-hmm. So I think you're right, and you, as you said, you're saying this to your friend, and look at my cup or whatever. And so the thing to recognize, as you say, is that in fact, what's going on there is an interaction between two people that involves this cup and so on. And that's always the case. We're always wrapped up in all kinds of other relationships with other people and political relationships and so on. And all that stuff is sort of happening at the same time. So that when you're looking at your cup or whatever, when you're drinking your coffee in the morning, you're making a move in that sort of total system. Mm-hmm. And so one of the main things then that Hegel wants to show in his book is, well, he is trying to bring out all those dimensions, and he's trying to show the errors we commonly make of disregarding many dimensions of that experience when we try to figure out what's going on. Mm-hmm. So talking about the cup, you've made a good point, right? The cup, may be made out of ceramic and it may be brown, but it is also that which is allowing you and your friend to communicate or to have some kind of shared experience, and it's playing a role in an interpersonal interaction. And that's part of the meaning of what that thing is. So you really have an underappreciation of what things are. Mm-hmm. If you don't recognize the role they play in our navigating our relationships with other people. So that's the sort of thing he's trying to do. He's trying to bring out the communicative dimensions of things, mm-hmm. or the political structures implied or lying behind things or supporting certain things. Like example would be, you have a car. Yeah, that says something about your socioeconomic status. It says mm-hmm. something about where you live in relationship to the history of technology. And mm-hmm. in a way, those meanings are all embedded in what it is to be a car. But we can easily ignore that when we ask what a car is. So yes, I think you're exactly right that Hegel's orientation is towards noticing and kind of grasping experience as a totality. Mm-hmm. And so the thing I wanted to add is the critical dimension, which is him trying to show the way we often misrepresent our experiences by denying dimensions of what's actually going on there. Mm-hmm. So that's when I was talking before about contradiction, that story of contradiction, if we played it out a bit, could turn into this point, right? It's the contradictions in our experiences of things are really the ways we kind of one-sidedly notice one aspect of something, but disregard the larger context it belongs in, and we get ourselves tied up in contradictory relationships. But yeah, so I think what you said is good.
No, yeah, and I like the point that you added there as well. I was going to say something about yes, that there is something that is talked about. I think you talk about it in one of your books, and I think it's pulling from Hegel, but it's this idea, this reference of the intersubjective, mm-hmm. which is kind of what you were just detailing there a little bit. And I would kind of make let me frame it in a question before I make any statements. I guess, do you see a difference between interpersonal and intersubjective experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I use the word intersubjective, I use that pretty broadly to mean all the ways that my experience isn't just mine, but that it also involves relations with other people, and that can be at an intimate personal level, it can be at a social and political level, and so on. So I think of interpersonal relations as being a particular dimension of the intersubjectivity that characterizes our existence. And it's the one that's most intimate and profoundly intimate, right? The way we as individual persons get tied up in intensely meaningful relationships with other individual persons, right? But political life I think of as a dimension of intersubjectivity too. But rather than being interpersonal, that's often impersonal, right? That's where, there's ways you're connected with all these people, but you don't even know them, So I use intersubjective broadly to mean all those kinds of things. But I'm also using that word to sort of say there's something about the very nature of our experience that it's never just sealed up in ourselves. Like there's nothing we do that isn't in some way grappling with the fact of other people, with the presence of other people. And then that can take many, many forms. And in fact, in that book, my book, Adult Life, I really try to bring out what I argue are sort of three really essential dimensions of that, which I call the intimate, the economic, and the political, right? But so I think of those as all the dimensions of intersubjectivity, and that's where all of our rich concrete relationships develop, but they're all developing on the basis of the inherently intersubjective character of our experience, which is to say, from the start, we experience ourselves as living in a world with others, basically.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'm glad you brought that point up. Because I think that's in the fourth chapter, I think, in that book. Yeah, I think that's right. So I think when in terms of intersubjective, maybe it's a semantical thing, but I usually see subjective as something that has more variance, right? Usually as something that is not objective, right? And so obviously you have two human beings, let's say, that are, you could even say other sentient organisms as well. I mean, a cat or a dog, but let's just say humans for now. You could say that you have a two human beings in dialogue with each other, or even not. They could just be in the same room, or they could be in the same space. That there is a dyad, right? There is something going on between two people, right? That becomes a shared experience, if you will.
Exactly.
And I'm not quite sure, and it's a kind of just a splitting hairs point maybe, but I see that sometimes interpersonal is also a dyad, but a totality of everything that's going on, the objective, the subjective, and the phenomenological. Intersubjective I see as more of the affective ways of how we relate with each other.
Yeah, okay.
And in one way. And so I try to see one as more broader, and one is more, again, about the subjective experience that one person is having with the subjective experience with another person's having. But, I could be just splitting hairs here.
Well, so let me see if I get you. I mean, I think I see what you're saying. When sometimes we say to someone, "Oh, you're just being subjective," and what we kind of mean by that is you're living in your own private take on things, and we especially associate that sense of being subjective with things like emotion, like how it feels to you, like that's just your subjective side of things.
Yeah.
And so if I understand you correctly, you are saying that notion of intersubjectivity, you use that word to talk about how that dimension of our experience can sort of be connected with what's happening with another person. Is that right? So
yeah, it's a dimension that's mapping onto all of the other possible dimensions of interpersonal interactions.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's good. Yeah. So in our emotional life, that's a big deal. Like that's what romance and, sexuality, that's all about.
Yeah.
Subjectivity in that sense of connecting with another person, not at the level of, objective facts, but at the level of subjective feeling, as you're saying. I think that's right. And I think that's when I talk about intimacy, I think that's where I'm most trying to pick up on that, starting with that notion of intersubjectivity in the sense in which you're using it, I think, right? That's there's what is more important in our lives than feeling like we're connected with someone at the level of those most intimate and subjective experiences. So that's what we want in love, and that's that's what we want in sex, right? And my books, I write quite a bit about love and sex to try to grapple with exactly those things. And so, yeah, I think I think Hegel's study of recognition is particularly potent for thinking about those things, because Hegel is saying there, this is actually, I think, probably the idea that most shaped my own development as I thought about matters of philosophy and psychology. It's this idea that, let's take sex. Like, yes, sex, there are lots of nice feelings, of course, like sensations, but at the deepest level, what's happening when you're with that other person is you are grappling with whether you're connecting. You're grappling with whether that person is actually treating you as a person when they're getting their pleasurable sensations, or whether they're treating you as an object, and so on. And so, so I think what Hegel lets us see is that question of whether my worth as a person is actually being acknowledged and recognized is at play in our deepest intimate feelings. And so that's really the core of what intersubjectivity is about. It's about, in your interaction with someone else, at the level of feeling, are you encountering the other person in a way that is recognizing you as a person, and so on. And so, yeah, so I think that if I've understood you correctly, I think that notion of intersubjective, that way of thinking of intersubjectivity, makes a lot of sense, and it's very powerful. And I think that actually points to sort of the tenderest and most vulnerable dimension in our lives. And that's where this issue of recognition that Hegel talks about turns out to be most potent. So is that connected?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. I'll just take the example of sex. So if you think about, what sex is, right? Well, from a physiological perspective and an evolutionary perspective, the act of copulation is objectively a few things. I mean, it's not a lot of things, but there's some type of penetration. There's some type of exchange of various fluids that we secrete, etc. And it usually has a whole like climax and the whole rhythm of it. You could talk about that objectively, and that's what's objectively happening in the sexual act, right? Like, you don't have to talk about feelings. You don't have to talk about any of those pieces of an experience to say this is objectively what's happening, right? And some people will try and distance themselves from that intentionally. But more often than not, many times, sexual activity between two people has the subjective layer, or I would say the intersubjective layer, which is what you were just describing, where there is a mix of emotions and affect and sensations, and that is another dimension with another person, and you're recognizing, I agree with you, their being. That is the full menu of what we call the sexual experience. Yeah. And so I absolutely agree with you. I think that's the right way to say it. And I think that makes it more, I don't know the right word for it. I don't want to say serious, but when you're interacting, here's one way of saying it. So sex is usually seen as an intimate act, right? And people can say that objectively. Why is that? Right? Because you physically are vulnerable, right? You're completely, you're completely naked, ostensibly, and your most sensitive parts are quote unquote exposed, and it's you at your barest with another person, and another human can give you the most pleasure, or they could give you the most harm potentially. And so that's always, a line that we ride all the time. It's okay. How is this person going to harm me, or are they going to love me, et cetera? Right. And you don't have to see it in such polarized ways.
I get you, yeah.
And so, and because I'm when you were talking, I was thinking about Merleau-Ponty's embodiment, which we'll come to, but it's one of those things where it's the most intimate, and I see the intersubjective in that way as like It's where the Ark of the Covenant sits in the Holy of Holies, right? To use a biblical reference. It's that aspect of who you are that is the most stored away. It's the most locked away in some ways. And to have access to that is very precious. And when you are doing that, right, and you are literally inside somebody, there is in that moment a unison of two beings, but it's not just physically or the objective. It is also the intersubjective with the affective piece, right? And the sensation piece all together in that experience. And it's all of those layers that makes up the phenomenology of it. And so in that way, I think it's this intentional collision with one's being with another being. And that's happening in that moment. And that is, I think, one of the most, I think for humans, I think it's probably true for other animals, maybe. But I think for other animals, because of different brain structures and how things are, it has less probably of the subjective experience, as far as we know. And maybe stays in the realm of objective, but it's at least that for all organisms. And so for us, it has or carries more depth and it carries more meaning. But it's not just the act itself, right? It's not just procreation. It's not just pleasure. I think you're right. Is that it unlocks a way of understanding human experience. Yeah, and then your own human experience, which again, there's various dimensions on that. Exactly. So yes, I agree with you, and I think it's a helpful analogy.
Well, can I just
please
cap that off for a second? I think what you said is good, and in fact, I want to send you an essay of mine called "Why Sexuality Matters," because I think it resonates with quite a few things. Sure. But I just want to quickly say one thing. You said, well, you can treat sex as this objective thing, and that if you can. But that would be an example of the sort of thing I was talking about before, where at a basic level, you're kind of denying something that's happening there, right? When you're interacting with another person, there's stuff going on between people. There's stuff going on between subjects. And so if you imagine that the only thing that's happening in sex is some body part rubbing against another body part, you're living a kind of a lie. Right, there's a misrepresentation, and as you say, it's possible for any person to decide that's what they want to do and so on. That's fine, but even that isn't a recognition correctly of the fact of what it is. That's a behavioral decision, and it's a gesture, and so on. So, I was saying before that what Hegel often tries to show, picking up on what you were saying, is that there's a kind of a totality. And we often misrepresent it by one-sidedly picking out one aspect and saying that's all it is. Mm-hmm. And sex is a great place to look for that because people do that all the time, right? Hegel would want to say in this context, there's a human totality there, intersubjective, interpersonal, all those other words. But you can imagine that it's just this thing that fits the objective definition or objective description. But if you do that, you're also making an intersubjective and interpersonal move, and it's not a very nice one, you know. So I think your description is good. And let me add one more thing. Mm-hmm. When you see the human experience of sexuality in those richer terms, then you can also understand better what's happening in sex, and then you're not going to say, well, sex could only be something that happens with a man and a woman, or sex could only, you have to like this kind of thing, right? Because it's not something that's going to be defined by these sort of natural objective features. It's going to be defined by people's attitudes and all the rest, right? Anyway, so I think what you said is good.
Yeah, it's a broadening of the horizon. It's one of the most intimate ways of experience of another human. So it's kind of a hard pivot here, but
I'm sure we can make it work.
In terms of Hegel, So you were talking about one of the other points when you started was this idea of the master-slave kind of thing. And I can't remember if Nietzsche was, because he has this master-slave morality thing. And I don't know if he was influenced by Hegel's description of it. Maybe it's different. But when you were talking about it, I was like, oh, yes, now I get the political theory kinds of stuff and why Hegel was so prescient for many, many, many political ideologies, namely Marxism, and people will kind of give, I don't know if you want to say Hegel too much credit, and I don't know enough about, pure Marxist theory to know how much, Marx was heavily influenced by Hegel. I know he was, I just don't know like how much of a reading he was doing when he did his own ideology, but kind of maybe talk about that piece again about, okay, you explained the master slave piece, again, in terms of the objective subjective thing, but then how does that and then Hegel's phenomenological philosophy then start to scale up or down, whichever way you look at it, into political theory, political ideology, and I think probably Marxism is probably one of the most picked on, I guess, from Hegel's philosophy. Maybe chat about that.
Yeah. Let me use Marx as a kind of point of orientation. I might say a couple other things about politics too, but let me pick up on that. Sure. I think I think of three writers. Adam Smith, who published The Wealth of Nations in I think 1776. Yep. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, 1807, and then Marx's writings starting especially in the 1840s. It seems to me those three thinkers, the things they say are not identical, but I think of them as doing much the same thing. So I think often when people talk about those three, I don't know, like there's a lot of sweating, and how are we going to distinguish this one from this one? There's a lot of effort in that, and I think that often kind of misses the point. I think these people they're reflecting a thing that was happening in human intellectual culture, and like they were the cutting edge thinkers, and especially with respect to grasping human political reality at the time of the Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. And Adam Smith is kind of writing right on the verge of that. So he hasn't quite seen what's going to happen. Hegel's writing kind of in the middle of it, and Marx is writing like after you've really seen it explode and seen how the world changed. So the aspect of that political and economic world that's sort of salient to each of those authors is a little bit different. But I think their analyses are very similar. And basically, what all of them see is that, well, actually, to go back to this earlier sort of theme of intersubjective and the other social and the other things we were talking about there, I was saying with Hegel that our experience always has these, I was saying, intimate economic and political layers to them, but we can easily not notice them. We can easily not notice how much our ability to function as the single individuals we are depends on the fact that we live in this particular kind of political society with all the infrastructure that's been developed and so on. Mm-hmm. When people talk about privilege, like that's kind of what they're getting at. Like you can easily live on the basis of social and political structures that you aren't required to notice, and you just sort of live off their benefits, right? And so what Hegel and Adam Smith and Marx were all doing was noticing the way that our lives, the shaping of our lives, really largely and powerfully happens at the level of political, economic institutions and structures. And of course, individual people make choices and so on. But the very way we're able to be individuals and the very context within which our choices, can matter and make a difference, those things come from these sort of larger movements of social and political culture that sort of shape us and form us. And so, Adam Smith, is basically has this idea that it's the economic dynamics of society that move history and that shape the form in which human life is lived. Hegel does something similar, and then Marx especially, picks up on that. So I think with So I want to say first, like that's in a way what they're all doing, and in all of them, it's kind of a critical enterprise. People tend not to notice that as much about Adam Smith in particular. I think they're wrong not to notice it, but nonetheless, they tend not to notice it so much. But they notice it a lot about Marx. But even in the thing I've said, you can see an inherently critical idea just in the fact that it's saying basically everybody misunderstands their own situation because we don't see ourselves as kind of pawns of economic history. We see ourselves as self-choosing individuals and so on. So all of those guys are really criticizing the kind of individualist interpretation of human freedom that most of us live with most of the time, right? And they're trying to show that freedom and human identity is structured and shaped by political systems and political realities. I won't go on more about Adam Smith. The reason I mention him, though, is just because he's kind of the original analyst of contemporary capitalism, and especially the analyst of the sort of labor, the idea that it's our labor that puts value into things, and that's so much than what Marx built on. And you read Capital, most of it is a repetition of the Wealth of Nations, just emphasizing certain different things, But so that's why I mention him. But I won't go on to talk about him more. But anyway, so what Hegel, I want to say a couple of specific things that Hegel says in his analysis, which then are really important for Marx. So that's the first thing I want to say, and then I'll have a couple other points. But
before you do that, now I don't know if it makes sense to answer this question after that or before you tell me, but I think just in the one piece that you were saying about political systems, I had this internal battle, and then yes, I've had arguments about it with some people about, is it the systems that cause these things or people within the systems? Because you have agents, quote unquote, agents that make up a system, and certainly they create a system for sure, but the systems inherently aren't pernicious, right? It's the folks that made them. They're man-made, and if you have enough bad players or bad agents over time, then sure, but the system inherently isn't that way. And so I don't know if you want to answer that now or after you get into the points.
Let me come back to that. I think I see where you're coming from, and I think that's an important issue. And it might be easier for me to address it directly after I've just said a couple other things.
Sure.
But yeah, I will come back to it. But so Hegel has a kind of interpretation of Western history, just like Smith and Marx do. And the particular thing I want to pick up on there is Hegel's analysis of modernity, the modern world after the scientific revolution. We associate it with the Enlightenment and so on. So the European world of the 14, 15, 16, 1700s, in which there was this, explosion of sort of modern science, and that went hand in hand, with European colonialism, which is itself part of the growth of the capitalist economy and so on. So Hegel has an analysis of that, and he, in the context of analyzing that, he especially focuses on the French Revolution, because he sees something that happened in the French Revolution as kind of an emblem of that whole structure. The French Revolution showed in a sort of nutshell the essential character of this modern world. And so the French Revolution is from the 1780s and 90s, is celebrated as the great victory of modernity, because it's a revolution built around human rights, the rights of the individual, and so on. And so that's sort of individualist democracy with good reason, and the overthrowing of kings, with good reason, seems like that modern point of view finally, running the world stage. Finally we have free politics. That's kind of the idea. And so, Hegel says, of course it is all those things. Of course it is the political success of that notion of the rights of the individual and so on. But one of the interesting things about the French Revolution is that by 1793, like 4 years in, the very leaders of the revolution were running around chopping people's heads off with this thing they call the terror. So Hegel this revolution that seemed like it was going to be a liberation of humanity turned out to be this terrifying, seemingly tyrannical structure in which everybody was, a plausible subject for execution. And so Hegel's analysis asks, why did that turn around? And this is an example of that thing I was saying before about things that are sort of processes that go through phases, right? So he's sort of saying, well, there's this phase of the revolution, there's this phase, but they're not just two different things. They're showing you the sort of inherently contradictory structure that was involved in that. And so what Hegel's point is that the very sort of premise behind modernity, the modern human culture that we find reflected in the scientific revolution, in individualist democracy, in capitalist economics, probably in other things too, in our everyday self-interpretation, is that it's built around an interpretation of what human freedom is. And it's built around interpreting human freedom as something individual and as, essentially as a kind of matter of individual choice and so on. But the core of it is that the individual is interpreted as if he or she or they were an isolated, autonomous reality. And so, I was saying before about how we can't fail to be involved in relations of recognition with other people. That we're already touched by the fact that other people matter to us and other people are in the world. Hegel's saying the large scale cultural interpretation of humanity has denied that fact about us, right? That modernity has this deeply individualist bias, or maybe I shouldn't say bias, maybe I should say assumption or presumption.
Yeah.
That fails to recognize about people the complex and very concrete relationships of recognition and so on that they are embedded in. So Hegel's point is that modernity, just like interpreting sex as just an objective act, right, is a kind of one-sided mistake. He says modernity has made a similar one-sided mistake in interpreting human freedom as just something exclusively individualistic, as if the individual could be isolated from relations with other people. And he says what that shows up in the French Revolution, in that French Revolution turning to the terror in a way, because what he says is the revolution is prepared to recognize the rights of individuals, but those individuals can't have any properties, can't have any features. They can't have any desires. They can't have any ties. They can't have any preferences. The only thing that the revolution will recognize is the perfectly pure individual. And nobody is a perfectly pure individual, right? And nobody can stand up for treating everybody as absolutely equal, because we are always going to love this person and not that person. We're going to want things for our family, not for that family. We're going to need this piece of food for ourselves and not give it to someone else, right? So there's something about any human individual that we're embedded in material and interpersonal and social relationships that make us specific, and those specificities from the point of view of that sort of discourse of individual rights, those specificities have no status. They can't be really recognized because those are all things that don't include everybody universally. They're all sort of exclusive. So Hegel's idea is that that very notion essentially of individual rights, while it rightly and importantly recognizes something about the absolute status of the individual. I mean, you were saying, don't individuals have to do things? Yeah, there's something irreducible about individuals, and it's only individuals who can be moral. It's only individuals who can feel the calling to do right and so on. So the notion of individual rights properly does recognize something essential about us, but it's not a concept that can adequately recognize the structures of dependency, the exclusive structures of dependency and so on that we're involved in with others. And Hegel sees that as essentially the problem with all modernity now, and especially exemplified in the French Revolution. Marx's analysis of capitalism is essentially a very rich and powerful development of that. Capitalism is an economic system that's similarly based on this kind of very abstract view of what individuals are. That's how it justifies itself. And that's also how it treats itself, right? Economics capitalism is treated as if it were a great thing because it's got free competition, it respects the rights of individuals and so on. But, it's how often have you heard, this company, polluted the water, or this company didn't give people time off to care for their family or whatever, right? It's that economic notion hasn't recognized the inherent embeddedness of individuals in interpersonal, social, material, natural relationships. And so capitalism as an economic system basically doesn't respect those relationships of dependency that all human beings rely on. And so Marx is trying to show that the capitalist system is going to produce a wasteland of the world, kind of like Hegel is showing the French Revolution and turning into the terror was implicitly showing that the kind of destructive side of this interpretation of humanity. So that I think there's lots more to say about Hegel and Marx, but that's the one key trajectory at the level of politics. And let me add one more thing quickly. Hegel also, in that very analysis of the master and slave that I talked about, has this really provocative analysis of labor, of work, because he says one of the things that happens to the slave who's being treated very badly is the slave does have to go out and work in the world to please the master. But in doing that, through work, the slave, it's not nice that the slave has to do that, but something is gained. The slave learns how to work. The slave learns how to interact with the natural world. Whereas the person who just stands around giving orders can be a complete ignoramus. Like, you don't have to know how to build a house, cook, anything, right? Yeah. So the slave is in an unfair human situation, but in a certain way in a privileged educational situation because the slave can learn things. And so Hegel uses that to say that work isn't inherently a bad thing. Work is that sort of means by which we develop this sort of sensitive and embodied relationship to the natural world, where we learn how to interact with it, make meaningful results come about by kind of cooperating with natural things, and thereby discover our own powers. So the ability to meaningfully work on and interact with the natural world is one of the ways we kind of make ourselves at home in things and develop ourselves as persons. So again, Marx, in his analysis of capitalism, especially in his famous analysis of alienated labor in the 1844 manuscripts, basically shows how capitalism turns work, instead of making it a kind of fulfilling thing where you get to develop a rich and meaningful relationship to the world, turns it into something that actually alienates you from the world, right? It turns it into a burdensome thing that destroys your body, gives you no meaningful connection with the world, doesn't let you benefit from the results of your labor, and so on. So Marx's analysis of the destructive side of capitalism and Marx's analysis of the distorted version of work that capitalism is based on, those are both very rich and powerful developments of ideas that come out of Hegel's analysis, similarly of essentially of modernity, his analysis of labor in the context of the slave, but especially his analysis of the French Revolution in politics. So let me pause there because I've been rambling on for a while, and I will still come back to your other question, but you might want to.
No, it's great. It's a really nice way of explaining the linkage here. One quick question is the master slave idea with Hegel kind of the precursor to bourgeoisie and proletariat in Marx? Is it kind of, I can kind of
I
see
think
the
so.
similarities.
The bourgeoisie and the proletariat are those are terms that Marx invented, right? Those are long-standing terms that that existed for the analysis or for the interpretation of contemporary life.
Yeah.
Marx does particularly try to show how they kind of play out a relationship that's analogous to the kind of relationship that Hegel showed between the master and slave. So that's true, in a very similar way, in a different topic, but in the 20th century, in Simone de Beauvoir's great work, The Second Sex, kind of, one of the inaugural texts of contemporary feminism, she does a very similar thing. She tries to show basically how the relation of man and woman is kind of structured on the same kind of master-slave thing, right? So, so it is very similar. Anyway, but I could go on to that other point you asked about.
Sure. Before you do that, just one quick question. When you were saying about you can definitely see, it's always difficult, right? We're looking at these things with, 2021 eyes, and these guys are writing about stuff, 200 plus years ago. And at the time, with Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, all these things, you could definitely understand these systems. I can definitely hear Adam Smith. I can definitely see Karl Marx, and I can see these ideas. I wonder if some of these things are the perils of democracy, and or capitalism, in terms of if you're trying to fashion your way in the world, and you're trying to for humans in certain states or countries, if you're trying to organize yourselves, and you're trying to organize yourselves in a very rapidly changing and evolving world at the time, from an agrarian society which is there for thousands of years or hundreds of years at least, you would want to do it differently. And obviously there was some pretty pernicious and tyrannical ways that various monarchies ruled over people. But I think what we have seen play out in the applied sense is, while those things are terrible, they did give some sense of order and structure, whereas leaving it up to a democratic and or social way of organizing also has its perils, right? Now, I am not saying that I am promoting a monarchy. I'm not saying I'm promoting an aristocracy, although I do think that there is something about the structure and order component that those things have that is I don't think should be thrown out, the baby with the bathwater either, because we definitely see the applied lessons of, crony capitalism is absolutely grotesque. And we feel that with wealth and income inequality at the moment. And it is, and kind of with Hegel's point, this very much this denial or aversion or repression of the intersubjective and how we fit in with other humans. But of course, right, the experiment of the 20th century with communism shows that, we don't even have the appropriate death toll or death count in the Russian Revolution and all over Asia of the perils and the carnage that was left from applied communism. And so there's obviously to each extreme ways in which this application on either system is not good for individuals. I think it's fine for some individuals, but for most individuals, and definitely not as a collective. So I wonder if there's some way in which learning the lessons of history and learning the lessons of philosophical ideas and then political theory, this is kind of just a rhetorical question, really. But, when we're at another point of a technological digital age, which is pushing us now into a whole another era. And I think you see some of these things that we think about in terms of regulation and censorship and big tech and how we do that. That's one very small angle of it, but that permeates throughout. And so, I just wonder how we learn from the lessons of the past of various ideas and systems and philosophies and say, well, how do we handle it now so we don't fall into the same potholes? But
yeah,
it's more of a rhetorical question than anything else. But I don't know if you want to say anything about that and my initial question.
Yeah, I can say something about that too. So a few remarks. First of all, let me pick up on one of the last things you said. You were saying, well, it's nice to get rid of kings and so on, but they did provide a certain kind of structure and so on. And John Dewey in his book Individualism, Old and New, it's from around 1930, makes a very similar point. That's a great book. Also highly continuous with the same kind of Hegel, Marx kind of trajectory. But he says there, I think exactly the thing you said, that, yeah, there may be lots of reasons why we're happy about those revolutions that have happened, that have brought us the modern world. But one of the things that went along with that is the very sort of things that people anchored the meanings of their lives on got kind of swept away. And so those things got swept away. A new thing came in its place, but it didn't bring with it the new resources to build a sufficiently meaningful sense of self and society and so on. Anyway, so I won't pursue that further, but I just wanted to acknowledge your point. I mean, I think that's quite a significant thing for thinking about what's happening in this revolution that's been going on for a couple of hundred years, basically. And Dewey, I think I mentioned him just because I think he quite nicely says almost exactly that, the thing you were saying. But let me carry on. Let me go back first to this earlier question you asked. Isn't it still individuals who act and so on? And I want to say something about that, because yes, at a basic level, you're right. There isn't anything that acts in human affairs besides people. People have to push the buttons. People do all that stuff. But I think the thing that Hegel and Marx are both saying is that individuals in their actions kind of move on the basis of big powers that they don't even understand and that they didn't make for themselves. And so, if you think whenever you develop a habit, I mean, this would actually take us now into the domain of someone like Merleau-Ponty, but I'll use this example anyway. When you develop a habit, when you're trying to develop the habit, you got to struggle with it and work at it, but once you have that habit, you can sort of do that thing without even thinking about it. And in your behavior, it's almost like there's kind of an automatic mechanism that now works without you even paying attention to it. And I can think about that with tying my shoes. I imagine I learned to tie my shoes probably when I was in around kindergarten. I don't remember exactly when it was, but I do remember that experience of finding it a little difficult to figure out how these laces went together. And my son is almost 5 and, he grapples with the same thing. And it's hard to get those laces together. Of course, I've tied my shoes for decades now and I do it very well. But the funny thing is, I can't show him how because I don't really quite know how, right? Even though I figured it out, it's now a thing that works automatically through my behavior. I kind of throw my fingers at the laces and next thing you know, there's a bow there. They do their thing, but I don't know how they do it. So the point I want to make there is, yeah, of course, it's me tying my shoes as an individual in the sense that no one else is doing it. But it's a weirdly kind of impersonal me. Like the me who's talking with you right now doesn't actually know how to tie shoes. Like I know how to flip a switch in my soul, so to speak, that lets it happen.
Right.
But I've long ago lost my meaningful awareness of what those things are that I'm doing. And so there's a thing in me that kind of works on autopilot. But so you can take that point to something like the social and political level. Like we embrace in our action, like a little kid learns how to say please and thank you. Or a little kid, something much more nefarious, or whatever the word would be, not nice, learns how to distinguish, the white people that he or she is allowed to associate and the black people he shouldn't associate with, right? You learn those things when you're 2 or 4. Sometimes you don't even know you're learning them. Like you just pick up on what your parents are doing, the same way you pick up on speaking English or French. Next thing you know, by the time you're 8, you speak English or French, but you don't know how you learned to speak them. And you hang out with the white people and hate the black people. but you never knew you were choosing that, and so it's still you as an individual who's doing it, but you're not really doing it as a reflection of meaningful individual choice at the moment. Rather, there's a thing you became habituated to that's now functioning on autopilot. And that thing you became habituated to was something more like a social structure. Like you learned how to grow up into an English speaking community, or you learned how to belong to a racist community, right? But so there is something happening at the level of the community or the society. It only happens through individual action, for sure. But what's happening in individual action is that social form is essentially shaping things and reproducing itself. So you're right to say that society in that sense, or politics in that sense, is never an agent. But it's what it is a historically developed set of interpretations that are embedded in the very practices and products that we learn to navigate with, such that in using those products and in carrying out those practices, we, through our individual actions, essentially let this social form shape what's happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, that's a very nice way of explaining it. I do like that. It really makes my centrist self very happy. I love balance. So it's both. I'm very pleased.
Social and individual.
Yeah, I love it. I guess I would say, I mean, I totally agree with that. I would say that this is a little prescriptive, but I think in both ways. I think this will bleed into the next point I wanted to talk about. So this will be perfect. I don't think as a society, we should assume that because someone is in a certain context or certain environment, that they will have those muscle memory types of ways of being. So, you hate the white people, or you hate the black people, or whatever. That may be true for the system over time with a bunch of very, pernicious individuals. However, the people that do live there in that system may not necessarily believe that way or think that way. And I think there's plenty of examples. So there is always, and this is what is so hard, I think, for most people, is ways of thinking about it that way. You have a script, or you have a schema. And so it's just super easy. It's like, yes, you're from here, or you do this, or you're from this place, or you're from this group, or whatever. Boom, here's what I know about that. And I don't have to think anymore. It's like, I think each time, in each moment, with each being, we have to say, let me treat this like it's the first time in its novel. Because I think in some ways it is, regardless. And so then you have to say on both ends, how do we say, can I see this person, this individual within this system or within this environment, that maybe they are falling in line or catering to whatever that is, and maybe they're not. And so how do we approach each moment or each situation or each interaction like it's the first time, like it's a new one? And that is, as we've seen over the past 10 years, that's a big ask. And it's increasingly a big ask of everyone to do that. But I think that's the way. So I would agree with everything you said. I think it's a very nice way of what you said it. And I would add to it that I think the even further application of that is treating each moment as unique, because it is, and that we're able to try and make it so it's not that way. That's not to say that you can't make changes at system levels and institutions. I think that's fair, but there has to be, it's a multivariate process. We have to keep all of the variables in mind to try and make sure that it's as judicious and and acceptable, I think, for the collective as well. So yeah, that's all I'll say about that.
Well, so can I?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, what Hegel and Marx are trying to do is, they're trying to analyze institutions, so they're trying to look at what kind of interpretation of human affairs is implied in the way this institution is structured. And so there's a kind of institutional critique. Mm-hmm. And I would defend that. I think that's a really powerful and important enterprise. But I think the point you're making is at the level, if I understand you, is at the level of dealing with persons. You don't want to confuse a person with the institution, for example. And I think you're exactly right that the very meaning of another person is that it's incumbent upon you to recognize you don't know who they are. And, you have to learn through interacting with them how they make a meaningful world for themselves and so on. And of course, they wear the clothes of someone from whatever, Iran, and speak Farsi and whatever else. Like, people bring with them the markers of a participation in particular cultures and so on. But you have to learn from that person what it means to them to have those things. So I think you're absolutely right about that, and that's extremely important. I want to add one other thing, though, that I think brings out more, from my point of view, the kind of critical edge of this. I think I think that point you're making is very important. And that goes right back to that theme of recognition, right? You're not recognizing the other person if you think, oh, you're from Iran, that means I know who you are. Like that's a right. Failure of recognition.
That's right.
But I think the place where this really hits home is when you interpret yourself. And that's where the point about habits and so on matters, right? That
absolutely
these analyses sort of need to make us see how hard it is for ourselves to understand our own actions. And, we need to, these analyses should tell us, don't be so quick to think that you know what you're doing when you're doing it. And they point to the need for a kind of unrelenting self-critical vigilance in trying to understand what may be nasty social and political structures we're reproducing by our seemingly innocent individual actions. So I think the thing you said is right on with respect to the analysis of, or the engagement with other individuals and so on. And I just want to then add the special place this has for thinking, for requiring us not to feel so confident about ourselves.
Well, yes, I will. I totally agree with that. I actually wrote a very large, or I guess if I should say very long essay. I put it in Medium just to put it out there on this very point. It was terribly long, but and probably not as good as it could have been. But basically, I was saying that I feel my observation of human behavior just in our culture now is this. There's a lot of this focus on the other and groups and things like that, but I see it as, and I think some of that's warranted and that's fair, but I see that as a avoidance and more so a projection of the things about ourselves we're not willing to analyze and to see and to accept. And so there's no way that we could possibly, in a healthy way, be able to make affirmative statements about other individuals or other groups if we can't first say those things about ourselves. And another way of saying that is you have to know yourself and to try to develop a healthier sense of self before you can try to do that for the world, I would say, effectively. Now, I'm not saying that you have to have arrived and be completely self-actualized, but I think a lot of this is that we see in society is that, people are very critical of things, or they're very, very cynical. And I just see that as a projection of how they view themselves half the time, because it's so easy to have it transmuted out that way, right? It's this externalization of all the incomplete or painful experiences of self. And the harder thing is to try and say, wait a minute, instead of looking at all these horrible things in the world, how do I look at myself and accept the things I don't like about myself, but that I can navigate more honestly and authentically with my being. And then that's going to shape how you're going to see other people or other things or other groups or things in life. And I think it's not necessarily a more positive way, but I think it's definitely a more authentic and a more holistic and a realistic way of engaging with self and then with others. And I think that's an important first step, or the journey towards that is an important first step, as opposed to just, kind of pointing at everyone else and being super cynical. But it's a tough ask. I realize that.
Yep.
So, okay. I feel much better about Hegel than I did an hour and a half ago almost.
That's great.
So that's great. Okay. So let's, I feel the pull and I have to do it. Let's talk about good old Marty. Let's talk about Heidegger. Because I feel like we've been leading into it, and I won't abandon Merleau-Ponty because I love him, but let's talk about Heidegger. Yeah. I know you are inspired or referencing him in a few of your books.
Sure.
So let's talk about first. I want to talk about the concepts about Heidegger, because I've talked about Heidegger in other podcasts with other wonderful guests, but I want to talk about his two biggest points, which are Dasein, and then also worldhood and or being in the world.
Yeah.
And those are big concepts and they're really tough, but there's a way in which when I teach Heidegger and when I talk about Heidegger, there's a way in which I try to explain why he's a genius and why his philosophy is tremendous. But I'm curious as to what you think about his philosophy. So maybe you want to just loosely talk about it, or maybe like an overture of his philosophy and why it's important and what it means. And then we can jump into the Dasein and worldhood.
Yeah. I share your view that those are the big ideas. There's lots and lots of stuff in Heidegger, but I think that the notion of Dasein and being in the world from his book, Being in Time, is the core idea, the core insight from which everything else develops. Kind of like I was saying, this notion of recognition in Hegel is kind of the thing. Yep. So I think you've picked on exactly the right idea. And in fact, given the things that have already come up in our conversation, I think there's a pretty direct link between those ideas and this. Like the idea of being in the world is basically that to be a person or to be a subject, to be a consciousness, doesn't mean that you exist somewhere in this little bubble of consciousness first, and then maybe you go out into the world and have some experiences. But rather, every person always exists as a kind of a set of relationships to a situation. We exist as ways of taking up, what he calls a world. We're worlded. Like, again, I mentioned my son a little while ago. Like he's lived virtually every day of his almost 5 years in this very house I'm sitting in right now, and in that sense, this house is a part of him. Like he can't really separate. He can't really separate his existence as an experiencing being from his running up and down those stairs and his seeing things from out of this window and hiding underneath this table or this chair. And so the core, I think, of Heidegger's idea of being in the world, let's say Dasein. Dasein, is a word that Heidegger used that basically translated means there being or being there. And I think, normally you might think, oh, I'm a subject, I'm over here, and the world is out over there. Mm-hmm. And so he's kind of saying, well, we actually exist as a there being. Like we are defined by all that stuff out there that we're involved with. And so being in the world basically means the same thing. The very way we exist is we're not inside a bubble of our mind. We're out there in the world. And that's where we are. So I think I was saying that in Hegel's analysis of the French Revolution, what he says modernity fails to recognize is the sort of specificity and particularity of the relationships of dependence that people are involved in. Well, that's essentially what this is saying. Like, to you, who you are can't be separated from the home you've made in a particular place with particular people at a particular time. And so in that sense, consciousnesses are not really interchangeable with one another. Like, we have a unique way of being a subject, kind of like we have a unique organism. You know, I'm this many inches tall, my face is shaped like this, you know, and you see this very sort of individuated character of bodies. Well, if we could, you know, just use the kind of colorful language of souls, we could say our souls are kind of like that too. You know, our souls have the shape of the unique settings that we grow out of. And who we are is more like the set of powers and awarenesses we develop through inhabiting that world and on the basis of it. It's not a separate set of things that, like, a detached mind has or something like that. Anyway, that's what I would initially say as a kind of starting point for being in the world. And I can go on and talk more about Heidegger, but maybe that's a
well, I would agree with everything you're saying. And you were kind of starting to lead down that when you brought up the example with your son. Is that, to me, so yes, so Dasein is, I've explained this elsewhere, but Dasein is, yes, being there. It's how we understand existing. But my understanding of Heidegger is that he doesn't want to understand existing, or human existence, if you will, right? What it means to be, right? His whole ontology is to try to say it's not as an object in a particular place, or it's not as a subject. Even your experience of yourself, it's kind of metacognition, as we could kind of say it. We kind of see the self, or we see us as kind of it's like a passenger inside a car, right? And so there's like the core self inside our body or inside our brains, but that isn't really true.
Right.
The totality of who we are is us. That is what it means to be. There's no there's no one sitting inside our body, you know, with a steering wheel, right? Exactly. And so all of our experiences, all of what's happening to us is us, right? It's being in itself, I think is how he describes it. And so there's this way of saying, how do we understand the very fundamental thing, which is, and he talks about the cogito from Descartes a lot, and he does bring up Hegel, but he's trying to say, that's it's incomplete. How do we understand the phenomenology of being, of what it means to exist, and then trying to explain that? And he's trying to explain that in German without using objective or subjective language, which is why it's just so painfully difficult to read. But I don't think intentionally. He's just trying to do that work of trying to say at bottom, what is it to exist as a person? So that's why he says, Dasein is always possessive. It's always my own, kind of what you were saying about the molding of consciousness. What it means to be you as and to exist is not to say, well, I have being and I could just as easily have another being. No, your Dasein is always possessive. You are the one that only has yours. And because of that, that's why it is always your responsibility on how you go about in the world, which he talks about this authentic and inauthentic way of being. And so, but more specifically, right? So if you think about phenomenology, I think the way he describes it, and I don't know if he's pulling from Husserl or if it's his own, but you know, phenomenology is to the things themselves, right? Which is literally is to say, how do you just get, it's like, let me use an object as an example. If anyone's ever bought anything at IKEA, right? And you have to deal with all these fucking parts that you got to put together. I hate IKEA furniture. It's great, but I hate building it. And I always feel like I've done enough things for the year. I've completed an IKEA chair or table. But if you have a IKEA piece of furniture and you take it out, there are the parts that are there. And then you construct it, right? And then you have your thing that you want, the table. In some ways, the phenomenology of things is just that, in my view, is how do you have the things? How do you have the parts? Let's not describe it objectively. Let's not describe it subjectively. So when you have the person, when you have your Dasein, how are you just uncovering or unmasking or unveiling, it's all these words he uses, the things that could potentially come from within your being? And this is why he writes about art so much, right? Because it's all of truth, the purest form of truth we could get is in art, because it's this kind of pure unveiling of things within us that no one knows, not even yourself, that are coming out. You could say, yes, there's certain priors of it as experiences in your unconscious and various, biological pieces, but you don't know it. It's not conscious for you. And when it comes out, it comes out. And his whole enterprise is trying to say, how do we understand that? We have spent much time over the objective and the subjective, and those things aren't bad, and we shouldn't stop doing those things. But how do we get beyond that and look at the phenomenology, the things themselves, and understand that experience? And the utility of that is, by understanding that, you're more informed to have an authentic way of being yourself, and there's only one of yourself, to then operate with the objective, subjective world. And that's the utility of the phenomenology of what he's saying. And so for me, the genius of Heidegger, I realized this last year. I mean, I've read him for a while, but I realized he put everything into being. He takes the metaphysical and the physical and subsumes it into being, because this is where it gets into perception and experience. But all of these things objectively exist in the world, whatever world is, right? And that's why he talks about different definitions and different dimensions of world. And they are. But he talks about things existing at least in three ways, right? Which is there's things in terms of substances. There's things in terms of utility. So this is the readiness to hand and present at hand. And then there's us, Dasein, right? And there's these different ways of existing. And we exist differently because we're able to bump into, right? Our Dasein bumps into these things. So, if you take the example of a pen, right? The pen exists, but it doesn't have Dasein. It doesn't exist in the same way that we do. The way it exists, and it's more of a utility, right? Is it has present at hand, right? And then readiness to hand. It does exist, but it's not until I pick up the pen and then I use it, right? That has readiness to hand, but it's my being that is interacting with that is making it useful and that is existing in a different way. And so for me, the idea of Heidegger is this whole notion of what we understand about the physical world and what we understand about the metaphysical, or things that are beyond physical, all come from our Dasein, our possessive being. We don't know it. It may still exist objectively, and that's fine, but it won't really matter in one sense if we're not interacting with it, we're not engaging with it. And that's the point of trying to understand. If you understand the parts, the pieces of what it means to be, you can then operate in a physical or metaphysical world and with other people in a more authentic way that is more edifying and that could have more value. You can place valence, you can place meaning and aims and purpose and all that. But his whole point of that is to trying to understand with Dasein, what are these central parts and how do we understand these things and the experience of them before moving forward and forging into objective and subjective, physical space and or, metaphysical ideas. So I'm rambling now, but yeah. What are your thoughts about any of that?
Well, yeah. So I think, I think just pick up on a few things you said. We do normally fall into this way of distinguishing subjective and objective, which came up when we were talking about sex, and someone says, oh, but the objective aspect of that is so and such, right? And we sort of pull these things apart. And what he's, as I think you've said, what he's trying to show is that there's something more basic than either the subjective or the objective. And that's what he's trying to name with something like being in the world, right? Yeah. And so what he wants us to do is kind of get behind those familiar ways we have of interpreting, or we might even say misinterpreting aspects of our experience, to recognize more honestly the real sort of dynamism of our experiential life. And when we do that, as you say, we actually recognize that we have a different kind of being than either subjective or objective. And that's what, he names with Dasein and so on. So I think that's right. And then I just wanted to pick up on what you were saying about authenticity. Like that move to breaking out of those familiar but limiting kind of boxes that we put our experience in, and moving back to understanding the sort of unique reality of our being in the world, right? And I guess one of the things I want to emphasize with unique is, I guess, the thing you were getting at when you were talking about is being possessive and so on, and what I was talking about with my son, like everything for you is coming out of this kind of unique bond of such that your identity can't really be separated from the specificities of your world and your situation and so on. Yeah. Authenticity is, in a way, getting back to recognizing that. But if you recognize that, it has consequences, right? Recognizing that about yourself isn't just learning a concept. Recognizing that about yourself is actually transforming the way you experience. It's changing your sense of who you are and what you're doing, right? And you talked about sort of bringing things up from out of yourself and so on, right? I think one of the things about authenticity is when we go through that process of coming to recognize ourselves as kind of the unique site where meaning is happening, well, actually, let me start that sentence a little differently, because I'm going to make it hard for myself to say things. So, but the point is this, like, imagine you are, I don't know, let's say 50 years old or something like, and I wrote a little bit about this in adult life when I talk about sort of what kind of happens when people have a midlife crisis. One of the things that can happen is you think, here I was rolling along thinking I was being a good dad, and I got a good job and a good whatever partner, and getting check marks for doing all the right things you're supposed to do. And you can start to experience a kind of emptiness of your life. And that's because, to use the language you were using, you've been kind of relying on this kind of subjective and objective split to interpret yourself. Like you had a vision of the world and what a person's supposed to be. And then you look at yourself as a kind of object and you say, did I fit that mold? And you got it. So you think, okay, I'm doing a good job. And then at the age of 50, you might start to experience the uncomfortable fit between that way of thinking about yourself and the fact that you have to live your own life. And part of the reason for that is because you start to recognize your own mortality, right? You start to realize you're getting older, and recognizing that you're getting older can bring to your awareness something that was always true, but that you maybe didn't have to notice before. And that is that this is the one and only time in which you get to live. That your life is this finite thing where it's actually going to be up to you to figure out how your life is going to mean anything. And in fact, if you've been relying on the check marks from society, you might be at a spot where your life is actually pretty meaningless because you haven't done much of a job of making something out of it. So it's in that context that, authenticity means changing your perspective so that you recognize what kind of reality it actually is to be a person. And as I was saying, like, that's not just a conceptual thing. It's like that revolutionary, life-changing perspective of the sort you can imagine in a midlife crisis or something, where you got to own up to the demands of figuring out what it's all about, of figuring out how life is going to be meaningful and so on, right? But even there, another unsatisfactory thing would be if you just went from sort of interpreting yourself objectively in the way I was saying to interpreting yourself subjectively, as if you could just say, okay, life means this or life means that, right? It's not arbitrary and idiosyncratic guesswork. It's an issue of being genuinely challenged by the enigmatic puzzle of what it is to be a human being. And in that sense, to figure out what life is about is in an important sense letting yourself speak, letting your own being speak.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean you, the familiar sense of yourself that you have, is just going to say what's on your mind. It's finding out kind of from the depths of your being what your humanity is trying to say to you. You know, and in fact, so I think if I just let me digress for a second.
Yeah.
I think you know, again, midlife crisis or situations of anxiety and things like that. I think that when sometimes people like maybe they're in a relationship, and at a certain point, like they just can't sleep, or they can't eat or whatever, you know, and they're panicky and so on, or something like that. Like those situations of essentially anxiety of a profound sort. Sometimes we think, oh, if I just had $100 more, or if I could just get a break, like we interpret them in this worldly way. But what's really happening there is it's kind of like your humanity or your personhood or your soul is saying, you're not treating me right. You know, there's something about your humanity that's saying, I can't put up with living in this relationship anymore and the way you treat me. And it's like your humanity is speaking to you, right? Mm-hmm. And so the authenticity is about hearing that voice. It's about hearing your own being as Dasein in the word he used, right? But it's hearing your own being trying to tell you basically that it takes some work to take care of yourself as a human being, to take care of the reality of being an existing being. And it's authenticity in that sense is not you saying subjectively and arbitrarily what you're going to say life means. It's going to be you adopting a difficult listening stance towards the deepest needs of, you know, your psyche. But again, your psyche not understood in that subjective sense, but understood as that sort of whatever that dynamism of being in the world is, that is the source of all your experiences, right? So that's kind of how I understand authenticity. And I was trying to talk about that in a way that resonated with the things you were saying. And I think I'm getting at the same basic kind of.
Oh, absolutely. 100%. I think that listening and curiosity to that, and I'll add on to that, is that only you can do that, right? Because it's not even, I can't say the you because it's kind of externalizing it, but like who you are and trying to understand or allow this introspective aspect of more of who you are to come out. It's a very hard way to explain it. And to kind of balance this out, most people don't do that because it's pretty scary. It's a lot of work. It's unknown. And so they will have the inauthentic way of Dasein, which is this idea of Heidegger talks about the they,
right? Exactly.
And this idea of, he has a very nice way of saying it. I've said this a few times, but it's, you know, it's where you hide out in the anonymity of the world, right? And you can just follow all of that work you have to do for your own being. You're just getting a inadequate and inaccurate surrogate of being from other beings. The problem is that only you have your being. No one else has it. They have a different type of what you have, right? Each person has their own Dasein, their own being, but you can't adopt from whatever their understanding of that is or how they're navigating the world and just say, yeah, that's close enough. And that's it. I mean, you can, right? But that's inauthentic. because you don't, not even you yourself, and not even all of these other people in the world know all the aspects of them or themselves and what it means to be.
Yeah.
I don't, you don't. That's the whole, once you get over the hump of, the like existential anxiety of it and, oh, how do I do this? Then the potential of value and meaning that you want to create and figure out and you have no idea makes life very exciting. It makes it so much more valuable. It's, I sometimes, if I get real dark, I'll say, I'm not really scared of death. I'm scared of not enough time. That's my worst fear. I don't have enough time. Right. And I wish I did, but, I think that's, he talked about that. And that's why he made this kind of way of looking at authentic and inauthentic being, because his whole emphasis was, there's so much to explore about yourself and only you can do that.
Yeah.
And that's the utility of that. Don't give time to false surrogacy from others who they don't even have their being figured out. Do it for you. And that's, to me, that's the applied power of Heidegger's philosophy with Dasein and with being. And so, we're saying the same thing. So.
Yeah. I mean, and just let me then say one more thing, like just to what I bring together, I hope is a provocative thing. Like, we were talking about Hegel and Marx, and that led us to talking about this need to be sort of self-critical about your own action and what's happening in your own behavior. Like,
yes,
that you can bring that, try to bring together the thought of that kind of self-critical perspective with this Heideggerian concern for anxiety. And I think when you put those two together, you get a really powerful philosophical and sort of psychological what's the word, a template for thinking about what we have to do in our lives,
Yes.
I think bringing those two thoughts together is very powerful.
No, I absolutely would agree. And so that was going to go to my next point, which was world. And I don't know how much you've read this or thought about it, so I don't want to get too detailed, but Heidegger thinks about, okay, well, you have beings, you have people, and they're in a space, and they're in a particular time, right? We'll leave time for another time, right? Yeah. But you're in a space. You don't just live in a vat or in a vacuum. You're in something. Well, I don't know if you say in, but you're, for lack of being too granular, we're in a world, we're in a space. And so he wanted to understand basically the world as context. You must have seen some of the films of Terrence Malick, where, that's what he's doing. He's literally doing Heideggerian worldhood through film, right? And he uses cinematography and like 3 years of editing, but he's trying to talk about different aspects or really lenses of how do we understand being in the world, right? And or worldhood. So I don't know if you want to just say generally, or we can go through the 4 different types of world that Heidegger talks about, but maybe just a general statement you want to say.
About world? Sure. I was actually thinking earlier when you were talking about relating to the other in the context of sort of cultural things and so on. I was thinking about this 4th book of mine that's not part of the trilogy, which is called Sites of Exposure. And now I definitely think I'm going to send it to you, because it's more or less about these issues of relating to how we think about relations of self and other, but also this issue of world. So yeah, these ideas are pretty meaningful to me. There are different senses of the world, but the potent one is, I'm not sure if I have another word to substitute for it, but you can talk about the world of the student, or the world of the carpenter, or the world of the citizen of democratic society or something. Like, the world kind of means both, as you said, the kind of spatial reality, like the fact that you are in a place which is sort of material, but it's also imbued with meaning, right? It's a world, it's a place that means something, that has a kind of interpretation attached to it as well, right? So, if I said the world of the student, like that is classrooms and buses and pens and paper. Well, probably don't use pens and paper anymore, but
no, not so much.
Handheld computers, those smartphones, and
right. Swiping up and down, left and right.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of swiping. Yeah. But the world of the student is those goods, the sort of material items and places, classrooms, whatever else. Mm-hmm. But there's also all those things held together by that kind of interpretation of themselves and the people around them as being involved in this practice. So like you can't separate the meaning of the practices or the projects that people are involved in from the meanings of those places, right? And so I think the power of Heidegger's notion of world, I mean, there are lots of things to say about it, but I think the power of it is this idea that the worlds, the realities we dwell in are in a way that you can't really pull apart, both sort of material and meaningful, right? It's those things, but those things as the articulation of a way of seeing or a way of acting. And so going back to the idea of Dasein or being in the world, ourselves can't be separated from a world.
Right.
And in that world, it's inseparably kind of material and meaningful, right? And that's in my book Sites of Exposure, I try to bring that out with respect to ourselves, like how our very meaningful sense of self comes with kind of building a home in the world in that sense, but then especially picking up on the theme you were interested in before, like what it means to deal with someone else mm-hmm. who lives in a different world. Mm-hmm. And it might even be someone who lives on your block, right? Yes. So they might have the same houses and the same fences, the same material, so to speak, but insofar as it's part of their world, that material carries a different meaning mm-hmm. than it carries in yours. And so it's the thing that we really need to understand about ourselves and about other people is how our identities and their identities can't be separated from the things of their world, but also how those things can't be understood just from a kind of detached, neutral perspective. You don't understand them unless you grasp how they function in the articulation of a certain project of living for those people. Anyway, but so I think that's the core of the idea of world.
Yeah, I totally agree. I see this idea of Dasein and world in whichever sense as this. It's like this symbiotic relationship. Yeah. You could look at that in an objective way as well. We're made up of bits of organic material, just like everything from fungi all the way up to other animals. We're multicellular organisms, and so there is an objective kind of way of being ensconced in the world in the same parts and evolution and how it's worked. There's the subjective of how I feel in the world, right? Or how I am in the world. But then there's the phenomenology of it, of this kind of it's so hard to explain. It's like a context, right? Like you can't have one without the other of sorts. And how there's these constant interactions. Let me just read this here, just as a way if you want to talk about it or not. But Heidegger thought about, this is from Being in Time, he thought about 4 ways of which we understand the world. And he said, world is used as an ontical concept, which signifies totality of entities, which can be present at hand within the world. Second, world functions as an ontological term and signifies the being of those entities, which we have just mentioned. And indeed, world can become a term for any realm which encompasses a multiplicity of entities. For instance, one talks about the world of a mathematician. World signifies the realm of possible objects of mathematics. Third, world can be understood in another ontical sense, not, however, as those entities which Dasein essentially is not and which can be encountered within the world, but rather as the wherein, a factical Dasein which can be said to live. And then finally, the fourth one is world designated the ontological existential concept of worldhood, right? Which is I would say probably the general way. So I don't know if you want to talk about any of those four ways or how you understand it.
I mean, I think the thing I was talking about is his third one, right? World can be
wherein,
in the wherein, but well, I'm talking about the third one and the fourth one, because then when we're saying that Dasein is being in the world, we're also, we're not just talking about some specific world, the world of the student or whatever, but we're also trying to say something about our own existence and saying it is the nature of a person that our existence is shaped by engagement with the world or something like that, right? So we're not talking about a specific world so much as we're talking about a very structure of meaningfulness in general, and we can sort of try to pull out a little more what it's like for there to be a world. And so that's I think roughly what the fourth one is. And so so I think I was talking about the third and the fourth, whereas he's saying in a more everyday sense, number one, world is used as an ontological concept and signifies the totality of those entities present at hand within the world. Like that's the way people mostly use the world. They say the world is all this stuff,
right?
And that's not false. But I think the point he's trying to make as he goes from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 is this notion, like number one, the notion of the world is just all this stuff out there, is kind of like saying sex is this objective process. Like, yeah, it is all that stuff out there, but you need to recognize that you're really just describing kind of in a superficial way that which more fundamentally is the phenomenon of people living worlds, and so all that stuff in the world, the way when you put it that way, is detaching yourself from your meaningful engagement with your world, and disregarding the way that other people are living through these things, and abstracting from all concerns of human reality, kind of looking down and just saying, oh, I can see a bunch of stuff, and there's a bunch of stuff, but it's like the skeleton or the corpse of human reality. So I think as he goes from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, he's kind of moving from talking about the correct familiar view we have that the world is all the stuff there is. Yeah, of course that's right. But he's saying when that's all that you can see when you look at the world, you've basically killed everybody. Like you're seeing the corpse of what's actually happening in our experience. Like you don't really grasp that house out there until you realize that people's lives are articulated through it. And for the people who live there, those bricks are, or maybe the windows, I don't know how people relate to bricks, but the windows or whatever, the carpets are almost like their beating heart. Like you need to see how things are part of the very embodiment of our ways of experiencing and living. And so I think as he's moving through those 4 kinds of world, he's trying to enrich our sense of what it really means that there are things. And so that first one is just the correct but kind of most superficial view of the world. And he's moving you to seeing, but what's really happening in those things, the reality of those things, is they are allowing meaningful lives to be articulated. Something like that.
Right. And that's exactly right. That's the present at hand. I was saying with the pen earlier. It's like, well, the pen's not thinking about when it's going to have lunch and when's the next time someone's going to pick me up and when am I going to get written with again. Right. It is available, or it is present, and it does exist. So much in the same way, there is the world where there are things that are there, but until you have one's Dasein that kind of collides with that, then it has this almost this readiness of doing things, and then you can build and build and build on that. So people will say things like, well, in my world, right, or in your world, right, and there's a certain type of action of sorts, right, that's going on. It's always kind of moving, and then I mean, he gives the example, and you give the example of like, but then we talk about the world of the classroom, right, or the world of philosophy, the world of psychology, or whatever. That's another way in which we're saying that these things have these it's like trying to understand all the potential ways and all of these things with other people that create its own kind of, world within a world, if you will. But then I always think of the worldhood as like the very larger thing, in terms of, planetary systems, or what it means to be our world, that kind of stuff. And so, but when you think about those things, though, and most people don't, I don't think, on a regular basis, we use these colloquially all the time, but it's one of these things where we have, going back to Dasein, which is only our own, each person then is navigating different dimensions of what it means to be in a world or to be in a context. And so, and it can be happening simultaneously.
Yeah.
And so people may say, well, who gives a shit, right? Why? Well, the reason I think that's important is because what it's doing is it's saying, what is your grid? How are you mapping on into things? And how do you do that purposefully? Yeah. From allowing yourself to, how do you allow things about your being to be uncovered in a potential context? And that's going to look different in different contexts or multiple contexts, and with different people and different entities. And that's, I think, the value of saying, so I was going back to Terry Malick, Malick's films, he writes different ways of understanding the world, right? Like if you think about the thin red line, this is the world of war. And what are beings doing? And, which is encapsulated in the country and the planet on Earth. But there's a different way of potentially being or existing as a human in that world, right? And then he also does this with some of his later films with kind of more modernized version of things. And then, he does his whole developmental kind of story about worldhood and Tree of Life. And, Malick's films are great for that way because it's showing different. I like The New World as well because it was one of those ways of showing a lot of themes of literally the new world and what that meant. But then what it means to have this kind of virgin land and how you're having of sorts, or at least for at least for the colonials. But it's one of those things where it's, how do we operate differently in novel situations in the world, right? And so it's all these dimensions of things of, again, you can't really talk about Dasein or being without context. And his context is world and how we're navigating through that. So I don't know if you have any other thoughts about that as well. But
I mean, I guess I had two quick thoughts. One, when you were saying, what does this matter? And you were saying, well, you got to figure out what this means for the other person in terms of how they're inhabiting and so on. I again was brought back to just the conversation about sex. Like it matters in exactly the same way that it matters whether you pose that question about another person's body. Like, do you think of it as just an object, or do you recognize it as that through which a person is living and embracing the world? And sexuality is something very different. If in your bodily engagement with that other's body, you are experiencing yourself as encountering someone's way of existing. Mm-hmm. That's very different than imagining yourself to be, physically manipulating an object that has no connection with people. And that's, so you can look at the world as just a bunch of things. Yeah. But that's like having sex with an object, basically, right? So I thought of that. The other thing I thought is just, your example of the settlers. I mean, that's just another great example of that. Yes, from the point of view of one group of people, it's virgin land. Mm-hmm. From the point of view of another group,
it's sacred home. Right. Yeah. And that just says, well, then how do people that have different ways of understanding themselves, how do they have ways of sharing a world? Or participating in a world together? I think that look like?
I think that is the exciting door that is opened up by this kind of analysis, because it says, well, that's what you'd have to learn how to do, right?
Exactly.
You never even pose that question if you don't think in these ways, right? And so I think the exciting thing that comes from Heidegger, and I think you would get something similar from Hegel too, in the lines we were talking about before. Mm-hmm. Like, it points to the need for using the material dimensions of our world as a route for establishing ways of meaningfully recognizing each other.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Where it's not really given in advance how that's going to happen. Like, you got to work at it. It's challenging and difficult. But if you don't even recognize that is what has to happen, you're just going to deal with yourself and other people badly, and all the bad things are going to happen, right? But so I think, yeah, this is exciting because it points to the need for developing a certain kind of developing a certain kind of shared way of experiencing, where that isn't a matter of finding something that already exists. Like, you really have to develop it. Like, it's got to be brought into being through your interaction. So it points to the need for that, and in a way, it also, well, more than in a way, it also gives you the resources for doing that. In that, it starts to give you the terms in which human life is actually articulated, or the things you do need to notice about other people. It doesn't tell you the specific thing that's going on with that person, but it tells you something like the structure that any meaningful life is going to have. So I think this stuff opens up the exciting possibilities for a kind of hopeful and constructive human future, in contrast to the kind of wasteland that Hegel sees coming out of the empty individualism of the French Revolution, and that Marx sees as the kind of consequence of the sort of blind juggernaut of capitalist technology if it's just left to run its own way, so I think this stuff in Heidegger is really exciting.
No, absolutely. Okay, so we'll leave Heidegger behind for now, and we'll talk a little bit about Merleau-Ponty.
Sure.
I'll just say one of the things about him, he's like forgotten, I feel like. I just, maybe in some circles, people talk about him and study him, of course, but, I think Hegel's big, Heidegger's big, Nietzsche's big, Sartre's big, but there's some people that kind of get lost or they're not talked about as much. And I think I've said this before, every psychologist should read Merleau-Ponty. I think he's tremendous. So I definitely want to talk about space and how he talks about it, because I'll be curious to hear your thoughts. It's something I have big interest in, but let's just talk about the two things in which he is super important and known for is perception and then embodiment, right? And that's really his big contribution to phenomenology. If, Hegel made the system or created a nice system, and Heidegger talked a lot about kind of the ontology and then kind of the world of things, Merleau-Ponty's space in this world is, well, how does it come through in the body, and how do we understand that? Because we can't divorce, much like we can't divorce being from the world, we most certainly can't divorce our experience from coming through the body, which is really important. And then there's a lot of implications of that. So, but maybe before that, or you can do it whichever order, how do you understand how he sees perception? Because he has a very particular way of saying that.
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest idea I see behind his talking about perception is that perception is not one little aspect of our experience that we can isolate from others, right? And so, in many ways, we tend to try to separate a bunch of things that go on in our experience. And his analysis tries to show how they're not separable. So in our immediate perception, when you look around the room and notice things, right, he wants to say that it's not like there's one thing, which is you getting a sensory stimulus, and then there's another thing, which is you thinking about that and interpreting it and understanding what's going on, and then another thing, which is you deciding how you're going to act. But his point is that perception, as we normally experience it, has all those things rolled together already. So in the very way that we see things, we're already seeing things understandingly. Like we don't get a layer of pure sensations first.
Yes.
Like, for example, well, actually, let me say two things. We see it understandingly. And furthermore, that understanding can't really be separated from our practice or our behavior. So like I'm sitting in a room that has an upright bass in it. And right now, I'm sitting talking with you, so I'm mostly ignoring it. But on other occasions, I would see it. And I don't see it as a display of brown taking up a certain amount of space and then think about it and say, oh, that's an upright bass, right? I immediately see an upright bass. But even more, I don't just see it as a detached object, but quite often I walk into the room and noticing it means I walk over to it and start playing it, right? Like the very way I see it is that it speaks to me of something I should do. Maybe the upright bass is too idiosyncratic an example, but that's how most of us see a door, right? You see a door as to be opened, or something like that.
Right.
So I think that the core and really exciting idea about perception that Merleau-Ponty has, and it's actually kind of picking up on this notion of being in the world.
Yep.
It's kind of like there's a direct connection between the things we might have sensation of and our own activities, right? It's like sensation isn't the registering of information. It's like the pulling out of view of activity. Mm-hmm. So our perception is our immediate recognition of an already meaningful situation where those meanings are already inside us, drawing us to act in certain kinds of ways, right? And so just to repeat that line, then I think what Merleau-Ponty is really doing in an extremely compelling way is showing how those very things Heidegger was saying about being in the world and so on are actually alive in the most elementary structures of our perceptual life, right? There's just no place you can turn in our experience where we aren't already affectively and behaviorally wrapped up in a world, right? Mm-hmm. And that takes place in the immediacy of our experience. So that's what I think of when I think of the exciting meaning of perception that Merleau-Ponty is picking up on. Does that?
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that kind of with that, there's a particular parts in the book, his main book, Phenomenology of Perception, which is, a lot of the book is very much, he talks a lot about Gestalt psychology, which I should make a distinction here, that Gestalt psychology is fundamentally, well, not fundamentally, but it is distinctly different from Gestalt therapy.
Very much, yeah.
Which many people get that confused or confabulated. And so much of, although it is influenced by Gestalt psychology, but, Fritz Perls and what he was doing with Gestalt therapy was influenced, but different. And Merleau-Ponty has criticisms of Gestalt psychology, but he also really likes it as well. But I'm mentioning that because a lot of his writing is in some ways very technical. He's talking about,
that's right.
Not really visual streams in the brain, but he's talking about vision and the eye and senses in a physiological sense, right? And what that looks like. But there's certain parts in the book, if I remember correctly, which is kind of getting to your point, which is he talks about it in a tripart way, if I remember correctly, which is you have the figure, the object, let's say in a room, and then you have the background, which is your context, right? So, going back to my cup analogy from the beginning, right? I have my cup, right? It has something inside of it, and I set it here on the table. But I now, kind of what you were saying with the upright bass, I don't think about these things, but I navigate my proprioception of being in space in the world tells me this. Oh, there's a cup, and there's a cup on the table, but I understand that within the context of it's in a room, and then there's the edge of the table, and then there's the floor, and then there's the wall, right? There's the background aspect, there's the object, and then there's, if you will, you. And so you're the one operating and perceiving. You can't, for him, you have the perception, right? But the perception is also from you being within where the things are within the background, right? And so there's this context of you're the viewer and the actor on the play at the same time, almost, right? And he tries to explain, and that's really kind of how perception is, which is kind of this, what you were saying about this activating these potential forms of meaning, or these things that are pulling from you in sensation to try and then activate all of those things. Is that about right?
Yeah. And so I think that's right. Normally the only thing we talk about is the figure in our perception. I see a cup, right? So he's really trying to bring out two other dimensions of our experience that are always there, but that we typically ignore. And when we notice those things that we typically ignore, it makes us change our views about a lot of things, right? So, the things we see, like I see that base, but I didn't say this before, but I could have. Maybe I should have. I see that base, but that base I am also seeing beside the piano and in front of the bookshelf and in a room. But part of what it means for that to be the background is that it has a kind of a sense, but I don't see it with the specificity and explicitness that I see the base. Like it is in that sense of Gestalt psychology, right? It's a background. It's in a sense noticed in a kind of unnoticed way.
Yes.
Right? And so that's you were using the word context, and that's exactly right. And so one of the most important points then is that, and this could even take us back to Hegel's analysis of the thing. I won't go through it, but I'll just make that connection. Mm-hmm. The point here would be, you never see a thing by itself.
That's right.
That thing, it takes up a certain shape, it has certain properties, but you can't separate that from all the relationships it has to piano and floor and so on. You said you want to talk about space. We can go back to that in a minute. Like, things are situated in a spatial field that is itself articulated through a whole bunch more things. Mm-hmm. And there's no way to have any of those things without this sort of embeddedness of any one of them in this larger context. So that's that first point. But then, as you also said, it's not just the figure and the background in perception, but it's also those things speaking to you. But then here's where his other really potent thing is: it's speaking to you as a body. Mm-hmm. Right? It's speaking, and here, let me just talk about body for a second. I think,
please.
You gave that as the second theme, and I think you're right. Like, that's his most novel contribution, I think. And the important idea there is, again, when most of us think about our body, we think about it as what he would call a figure of perception. Like, we imagine we're looking at it. We remember what it's like to see an organism or human organism, whatever. We think that's my body. But his point is that in the actual living out of our experience, that's not how we experience our body. We don't experience our body as an object with clearly defined parameters that we might see as one thing beside other things. We experience our body as our very capacity to engage. So the fundamental experience of the body is the sense of the possibility to connect with the world. And then going back to what I said earlier, in any experience, any given experience is actually drawing on that. It's calling out of us certain ways of behavior. So in a sense, you could say with Merleau-Ponty, we only perceive by acting. To perceive the doorknob is to turn it and open the door, or to perceive your friend is to wave and say hello. Right? There's a way in which these aren't separate processes. It's that the very perception of that thing calls from your body this meaningful response. So there's the figure, and that figure has a meaning that is itself defined by a contextualizing setting that is concealed or sort of non-apparent in experience, even though it's integral to it. And that whole setting also is inseparable from a way that our bodily being is energized, the way our bodily being is triggered and called upon to interact, right? And so those are the really rich things that he's adding to. He's saying there is no experience that doesn't have a background on the side of the object or your bodily engagement on the side of the subject, if you want to put it that way, right?
Yeah.
And so any kind of analysis of experience that ignores those things it's like calling the world a bunch of things, right? It's isolating one aspect of experience from the fuller phenomenon, and doing that kind of dishonestly, right? It's not really acknowledging those deeper dimensions. And so, that's important for, cognitive theories, and the whatever you would do in that kind of psychological investigations of the nature of knowing and so on. But it's super important for psychology in the sense of
absolutely
how we live a healthy life.
Yes. Well, and that's the point, right? Is I've explained it this way to other people of, if I'm going to bring a new idea into this, but not really talk about it. If you had a way to kind of upload consciousness to a computer and you could still live on, it still wouldn't be you, because it's through the body, right? Whatever consciousness is, right? I'm not going to have that debate, but what it means to be you, right? And all of the particulars is you need all of it to be there. And much of it is through the body. I see the body as the vehicle for how we're maneuvering in space and how we're experiencing things. And it's an essential piece. If you think about it in terms of the negative, right? When the body breaks down, or you don't have to think about it that way. If you think about it in terms of, there is this way in which the body is always affecting the mind and the spirit and the soul, or whichever ways you want to talk about it, right? The kind of interior of you, like, you can't separate that, right? And so it's a conduit, it's a bridge, but it's essential. And he's explaining how it's essential and how it's essential through the perception. I want to just highlight the aspect of, or the difference rather of what he's doing as opposed to what Gestalt psychology is doing. I think I can do it. And then we can talk about space. Mm-hmm. If I recall correctly, it's been a while since I've read Gestalt psychology, but their whole thing was really important in understanding modes of perception and how we understand figure ground, the whole Gestalt, the holistic aspect of things instead of just pieces. But they were doing this mostly on an objective plane. And Merleau-Ponty is fine with that. But what he's trying to do is, well, how do we understand that in terms of a phenomenological plane, which is encompassing objective and subjective, but more so beyond that? So in his book of, I think in Sense and Nonsense, he really talks about this a lot, and maybe a little bit in Visible and the Invisible and Invisible, where he builds on this, where exactly what you were saying, like and we do this all the time, and like that's why I like your stuff, is because you're kind of showing how we do this in everyday life, right? And so a lot of these guys, again, no one's reading Being in Time, Phenomenology of Spirit, and Phenomenology of Perception. It's tough. It's tough. It's a language. It's hard. But we do this all the time. So, for example, there's how do I say it? So I'll go back to your upright bass thing. It has a sense to it. It has because it's been used, and it's been used by a particular person, or maybe many people. And then it sits in space. And if it sits in a space for a long time, or if it gets moved around, or there's something where, this is why musicians, they get so attached to a particular guitar or a particular instrument, if you will, because it almost has its own kind of way of being, or a way of existing, not obviously in the way that we do, but And a lot of that is because of the interaction of a person interacting with it and using it for certain things. And there's a sense to it, right? And there's an experience of that, which is more than just figure ground, Gestalt, what Gestalt psychologists were doing. That's important, and that is a real thing. But it's more of the total aspect of how do we understand the experience of all of these things and how they interact with various beings. And so I don't know if you want to say
that. I mean, I think when you were talking about the base and so on, I mean, I think you were bringing out another version of a thing you were bringing up before when you were talking about subjectivity and intersubjectivity, right? It's almost like you could talk about a kind of intersubjectivity between you and the base. I mean, the base isn't a subject, but there's a way in which the meaning of that thing for a person who uses it is wrapped up with the affective life of that individual and so on. And in a way that person's affective identity is in part embodied through the base, and it's, it means that you can't so easily draw lines separating, where the person ends and where things in the world begin, right? It's that notion of being in the world again, right?
Right.
So when the person who's a lifelong professional bass player encounters the bass, like it's not so different from you and your mouth when you're speaking. Like you don't even think about your mouth. You need to speak and words come out. And man, where would you be if you broke your jaw and couldn't use it? That you'd be totally crippled. Well, the bass for that person is similarly, it's almost like an organ of that person's body, by which they're able to articulate and express their own existence. So I'm just trying to pick up on that last point you're making. Like, these things come to be incorporated into our own bodies, basically.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And so this is a nice segue for space. So so I want to give me a little runway here. I'm gonna launch into some ideas I've had on space, and then you can tell me. So just bear with me.
Sure.
And I know I've talked about it before, but I don't want to repeat myself, but whatever. So, okay, with space, so fascinating, right? Because space, and I go full Merleau-Ponty on space. Heidegger talks about it in terms of directionality and deseverance, right? Where one's being or one's Dasein brings things in. It's always in proximity, closeness or farness is how he talks about it, which is fine. I don't disagree with that, but it feels like a rough sketch, and Merleau-Ponty just goes way further. So space, I've asked, so when I teach, I ask students this. I say, tell me what space is. Not space like, out where we sit in the planets and stuff, but space, like I'm sitting in a room and there's space. And they can never do it, right? It's just the hardest thing to just, how do you describe it, right? It's very difficult. Because it's not a thing per se. It's the kind of the absence of a thing. But it's definitely there.
Yep.
In a way.
It is the there in a way.
It is the there in a way, right? And so Merleau-Ponty had this idea that space is very much, we were just talking about, is very much connected with the person because we inhabit the space. And another way is we are of space.
Right.
It's not an externalization. It's not, we think of it that way. But it's not accurate completely because it is, we inhabit it. And then I think that we leave ourselves in space and that it is there in space, right? So here's an example. So I know you talk about this in one of your books, and I love that section because I'm like, oh yes, I thought about this, is the idea of a home.
Yeah.
Right. It's so powerful. Because I think if you can understand this, you can understand it's kind of like a microcosm of what Heidegger was saying about the world.
Yeah, I agree.
And not a perfect fit, but close enough. So here's usually the example I usually give. So if I invite you to my house, right? That might be a long drive for you, but I'm down here in Maryland. But if I invite you to my house, you come in and you see the living room, right? Now, we all have schemas and ideas of what a house is. There's different types of houses based on the structure and how they're organized, et cetera. Okay, fine. But when you come into a house, let's say you have the skeleton, you have the ontical kinds of aspects of it, right? The things. But you come in and so if you were to come into my house, you would see my couch is arranged this way. You know, I have a table here, television's here, a plant here, another chair over here. And then there are paintings and prints that I have that you know our family has collected or done over time, and that are framed and hung on the wall in a certain arrangement.
Yep. There
are things that we have collected from various trips over the years, that there's a shelf where they are arranged and organized in a way. And so when you maneuver through the space, there's nothing objectively about the space that tells you anything. You know when you come into the house, and you know when you come into this space, that someone lives here, someone inhabits this space. How do you know that? Well, these things don't have a mind of their own. They don't have legs. They don't have arms. They don't put themselves in these places. Someone had to do this. Okay, you can at least say that. But then there's the particular arrangement of how space works. Now, people may not think of it this way, but if you know, for example, right, there's a picture behind me, right?
Yep.
There's two actually. Well, someone had to buy the print, which says something about them. They like it, it's appealing, it's aesthetically pleasing, etc. They picked out a particular frame. And then they decide, well, in this room on a wall, I'm going to do something that is not required. I don't need to put a print or a picture on the wall, but I'm going to, which gives incentive. It gives motivation. Whatever it is may be unknown, but you know there is one, right? Of sorts. And it might be unbeknownst to the person, but whatever, right? There it is. So you can say, oh, that's a nice painting, or that's a nice print. And it might tell you something about the person. So let me make this more concrete. If I have a picture of, or a print of Salvador Dali, I'm like, oh, he's one of those weirdos, right? Or if I have a Picasso, or if I have Jackson Pollock. Now, you know, everyone likes different things or whatever, but it gives you a little bit of a flavor of where they're at, right? Every time I go into someone's house, I always look at their books. What are you reading? But okay, but when you move into space, someone put that there, and someone specifically put that there in that way, on that part of the wall, those dimensions, and they did it for a reason, unbeknownst to them or not. When that person is not in the space, right? When I leave out of this room and I close the door and there's no one in here, part of me inhabits the space based in the things and where I place it.
Yeah. Which
makes it alive, which makes it meaningful and valuable, right? Potentially. So let me give it another way, right? Let me make this more personal. This has happened. So typically people will come into a house and you do the whole shebang, right? You come in, maybe you're having drinks, maybe you're having dinner, maybe you're having whatever, you're watching a movie. And there are acceptable areas and unacceptable areas to go in a house. Yeah. Now, this may or may not translate cross-culturally. I don't know. I'm not a sociologist, but I would say in my experience, that this has been the case. People come into the house and here's the living room and here's the couch and you sit here and, maybe here's the basement and here's the dining room and here's the kitchen and here's the deck or here's the backyard or whatever, front yard. And then usually with most homes or even an apartment or a townhouse, there's usually like a bathroom where you can go. And so sometimes, let's say, going with my analogy, you come over and you say, John, you drove a long way. Let me show you my house. I'm going to show you my house. Let me show you my house. And you say, okay, cool. And I show you all the main floor living areas. And then I say, okay, why don't you come upstairs? Sure. So you come upstairs and I bring you into this office and I say, you see, here's my office. This is where I do work. This is where, whatever. Okay. And then here's the bathroom. Okay. And I say, well, you want to come to my bedroom? Immediately people start to feel a little weird.
Yeah.
Because typically only two things happen in a bedroom: sleep and sex, right? I mean, it's the bathroom and whatever, but it's that intimacy thing we were talking about earlier. And no one's in the room, right? But if I were to say, yeah, here, why don't you come in the room and sit on my bed? That's going to feel very interesting for most people because it's going to feel almost like a very intimate or almost in a way of a potential violation, even if I'm giving you the permission, even if I'm standing in the room. I've had friends come over and I'll say, yeah, why don't you come in the room? Right. Because, it's sort of a projective of sorts. And I'll see people start to like really get nervous. Right. No one's in the room. Nothing's happening. Right. Oh yeah. That's private. But there's nothing about the space objectively that makes it private. It's just a room. It's just things in a room. But it's not. Yeah. But it's not. Now I'll take it one further level.
Yep.
Now if I show you my room, and let's say you're fine with that, right? You should. Oh yeah, it's nice, whatever, right? I said, okay, let's go down the hall. Go down the hall. Open the door. And I say, this is my daughter's room. There is something very powerful about the space of the innocence of a child and having other people to come into that space. I remember one time I had a friend come over and I did this, right? And he said, oh, and he did not, it's almost like there was like the blood over the door. He did not cross that threshold of like the door into my daughter's room. And from where is that, it was me, my wife, and we're there showing you the house and here's the room. And it just barely, peeks his head into the framing of the door. I said, come in the room. Oh, no. That's her room. I don't want to. It's like, no, it's fine. It's fine. And this is a good friend, right? This isn't like an acquaintance or someone from work. Like this is a good friend. No. Now, that is saying something about him and his notions and what his ideas are, right? But even just beyond that, right? There's nothing. It's just a room with a bed and a desk and a dresser and all these things, but it's not, because the person lives in the room. They inhabit the space. The space becomes alive. And so how do we understand space is to be personal, right? You cannot divorce space from being personal. Now, not all space is personal. Some of it is not, right? You can have collective space, right? People go to a stadium and, whatever. But even there, you can say like, there's the home stadium and the away stadium, but or a park or whatever, it's a shared space in a community, right? That's fine. There's different dimensions of it. But the point is that it's inhabited by individuals and by people. And so in the terms of a home, it is something that is very personal. And even when a person is not in the room, even when they are not in the house, a little bit of them inhabits the space and the things that are there, because it's a that transmutable, that externalization of yourself in those things and in that space. And that's what you would call lived space, I would say. So I know I went on, but what are your thoughts about
I mean, I don't have much to add. I mean, I will say two or three little thoughts that came to mind, but I think what you said is all, quite good. I had a couple of little thoughts. Like, one is like this whole thing is taking us back to the initial remarks about the thing and recognition. In a way, your friend not wanting to go into your daughter's room is proper in the sense that your friend is recognizing another person who needs to be respected, and that other person isn't there in her bodily organism,
right? But
that's her embodied in that room, and you're disrespecting her reality if you think you can just go in and poke around. So I think I think that's absolutely right, and I would add another just example of that, like that's why it feels so awful to at the age of 40, watch your childhood family home get bulldozed down to be built into something else, because you can recognize that you are actually in those rooms, and people have similar experiences with the death of a partner or a family member, or just breaking up with someone. Like, part of you goes away with that other person. That's a sort of metaphor we use, but it's phenomenologically true.
Yes.
Right. So I think the thing is, places are like that too. And that's why it's weird to have somebody else move into an apartment you used to live in, or all those things. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I'm basically just agreeing with you. I think what you're bringing out of Merleau-Ponty is absolutely right, that a phenomenologically honest description of our experience of space has to acknowledge that spaces are inhabited with subjectivity, right? They're imbued with subjectivity. So I think that's right. Again, going back to the example of the settlers coming to virgin land, I mean, that's there you have that same thing again. Like, there is a fundamental dishonesty in landing on the shores of North America, not experiencing yourself as encountering subjectivity or other people when you go into those forests or on those plains, right? So yes, I think I'm just echoing things you said with a few different examples, but I think those points are very important. I wanted to add a little thing, it's not in any way a challenge, but just brings out another side. You were saying, okay, these are personal spaces, but those are different from some other things. But it's interesting, I think, if you imagine common spaces, whether it's a stadium or whether it's like a city street or a highway, the thing, it seems to me, the thing from my point of view, to notice there is that to experience the highway as something that's open for anyone is still a version of that same thing, right? It's a way that people recognize the proper form for human occupation of this space. Like, so the highway can only function that way because everybody basically agrees this is a space for anyone. So there is still, it's not like that issue of how subjectivity imbues the space went away. It's just a different modality of that, to recognize a space as a commonplace, right? So I think what you said is right, and I think one can use that very same way of thinking to notice. Well, I'm just going to start that sentence a little differently, make the same point, but say it a little bit differently. It is a collective action, a collective practice to let a space be common and public.
Yes.
That doesn't attach to raw space any more than anything else does. And that also means then, when we encounter a society like, let's say, contemporary North American society that has lots of public spaces, we should recognize that notion of an indifferent public space is as much a reflection of our culture as are all those other things that we do. I say that because you can imagine going to at least certain parts of India that are very shaped by, what I would think is a pretty unhealthy interpretation of human lives in accordance with caste and so on, where there's no such thing as a space that's open to anyone. Like the very notion of space is charged with the sense of caste. And this space, there are some people who aren't allowed really in any spaces, and so on. The point I want to make there is that you can whether you like it or not, you can imagine someone with a very caste-oriented perception from India not feeling comfortable in your shared public space. Like you think, we're just being open, anybody can go here.
Yeah. And
there might be people who don't feel comfortable there because you're allowing people into that space who shouldn't be allowed into their space or something like that. My point here isn't so much whether that person's perspective is good or bad. My point is that it's not culturally neutral to take up a space as indifferently public. And so all I want to say then is that notion is not unlike the notion of a kind of subjectivity in your daughter's room. Right? That
absolutely,
even to interpret a space as public and open is still a very specific way that a kind of subjectivity, in this case a cultural subjectivity or a shared subjectivity, is seen to be integral to that space. And that can actually be a kind of subjective inhabitation of space that conflicts with other people's ways of inhabiting spaces. So as I said, that wasn't in any way meant to be a challenge to what you were saying. It was I wanted to take your line of thinking and move it in another direction, just to show that even in those places that some people might think aren't subjective, there's still a kind of subjectivity shaping them. Anyway, so I don't know that I have much else to say. No. I think what you said is great.
No, that's great. I really like that, and I agree. I'll just say a few comments about that, and then we can move on. But about the space thing, I forgot. It's like one of those things where when someone comes and invades a home, oh my goodness, it's like it's like who cares? It's just stuff, right? It's just a room, right? It's like, no,
that's not what it's like to you.
Right. Like, no, like we're in it, right? No one is saying like, someone came in and, like took all my stuff or whatever, even if they took nothing valuable, right? They just, flipped over all your pictures or something. It'd be like, such an invasion. You would feel because we put sort of our most vulnerable, our most intimate, and then it's there and it's in these rooms and it's in these things. And so when a intruder comes in, it's like almost a violation of our innermost being of sorts. And so
that's right.
There's a really big potency to that. I'll just say one other thing about the space piece of it is I thought about this a lot over the past year. Is I have a piece that I've written that's been on the shelf and I have to keep finishing it and I'll eventually do something with it. But which is that I think space was one of the biggest things that hurt people or pushed people to think about things differently throughout the past year because of the pandemic.
Oh yeah.
Because basically we have understood that, well, here is my house and this is where I live. There's some leisure activities, but it's where I live, right? And then there's a space, a physical space to work. There's a physical space to work out. There's a physical space to do other activities, go to a bar, go to a concert, go to a stadium, go to a game. There's all these things, there's all these physical spaces where we have a particular activity or activities. And what ended up happening over the past year was all of those became absolutely folded up and engulfed in one space.
That's right.
So what happened? All of the appropriate boundaries that we distribute with space were completely knocked down, and we could not do anything about it. So if you have a blurring of boundaries or a decimation of boundaries of space, what it can do for individuals is it can create a lot of chaos. It creates a lot of internal chaos. And if you're forced to do it, like as we were in the past year, what it says is there's a type of entrapment, but it's this one thing where it's like having to do everything, working out, work, leisure, sleep, eat, everything in one space where there's no boundaries anymore. Now the boundaries are, this room that's been converted into 3 different things. I just go to this side of the room on this table, and now that's my, whatever.
Yeah.
That created so much chaos and so much disruption. And I think most people don't think of it that way, right? Or maybe they kind of do in a roundabout way. And I think it's this notion of we need boundaries of space. But I also think the positive aspect of all of that is it can, for some people, have them recognize how purposeful or how authentic do I want to do things in particular spaces, and why? Because you're able to say, when I have no boundaries of these things, not because of anybody's choice necessarily, and I feel more chaotic, how can I have a healthier understanding of myself in particular ways, in particular spaces? And so I think that theme of kind of boundaries being kicked over or knocked over, boundaries of space being knocked over the past year, was the thing of sorts, the phenomenological experience that people couldn't quite understand. It was like, yeah, it's, I'm scared of the virus, or, life has been disrupted, but they couldn't really put their finger on it. And I feel like some of that is the boundaries of space were completely knocked down. And that was what was causing a lot of intrinsic chaos for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it's an excellent point. And, but I think the truth is probably most people won't really realize that. People feel uncomfortable, but they don't immediately see why. And that's part of the power of this kind of philosophy, is that it can let you understand why, it's not just a practical inconvenience to have to do everything in one room. It's a radical existential change, and not a very nice one, right? So I think your point is a very good one. And I might just add, there are lots of nice things about computers and all the rest, but one of the things that I think is a little bit sort of frightening in general about the sort of digital revolution that, as we experience it now, is that it kind of brings with it an illusion that place doesn't matter. Because everything is done without regard to spatial situation, spatial location. You can do everything over the computer, so you can do everything, and it doesn't matter where you are, and so on. So there are surely good sides to that, but it's a kind of technological revolution that encourages us not to notice how important our sort of spatial and habitation is. And so, for reasons very much like what so I guess your point about the pandemic is kind of a particular occasion that's bringing into focus the thing that I think is actually more broadly true about the whole sort of state of the current technological situation. And so I think we as human beings in general are kind of on track for a kind of malaise, kind of unhappiness in our existence.
Yes.
Because of an implicit erasing of spatial significance that we might not even notice, but when in fact that's of profound importance for our embodiment and sort of existential health.
Yeah, and if space is an extension of how we further understand our own being, well, if we're feeling chaos because of the boundaries that aren't there, well, sure, that is certainly true. But my hope would be, instead of the malaise, that people would say, yes, but how can I be more intentional
right
about how I navigate in various spaces when things become a little bit more normalized. And
I agree.
I hope that is the major, lesson, if you will, that we can gain from this. Well, I'll say this, John. It is this conversation was absolutely everything I wanted it to be and more. I really mean that. I was really wanting to. I've been starved of some good philosophical stimulation. It was very enthralling, and it's again, I could really keep going for another 3 hours, but I want to be mindful of your stamina, mine, and definitely listeners. But is there any final statements or things that you want to say about any of the topics we've talked about today, or other things that that you've written on, or anything, final things you want to say?
Yeah, just that I hope that when the pandemic lets up, you'll invite me to drive down to Maryland.
Of course. Yeah, come down and we'll have crabs on the Eastern Shore, and absolutely. Right. I'm always down for that.
No, but this has been great. I've really enjoyed talking with you. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, no. Likewise. I guess the one thing is tell people where they can find you, where they can get your books and find your papers and everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way to find me is I have a YouTube channel, John Russon, and I have put I think I got close to 100 basically lectures on different figures in philosophy. These people we've been talking about, for example, and some others, and most of them are half an hour, 45 minutes long, but they're so I think people can tune into that to just, if they want to hear me talk about history of philosophy. I try to do it in a reasonably engaging way. These books, Adult Life, Human Experience, Bearing Witness to Epiphany, or Sites of Exposure, I would be delighted if people would read them. Lots of people teach them in their classes at university because,
That's great.
Because they were meant to be things that you can make sense of in a kind of personal and immediate way while still bringing kind of deeper content. So I'm really always hoping that people will read those. And I teach at the University of Guelph, so people can find me there. I have a website that's down right now, but it's going to come back up, johnrusson.com.
Okay.
But yeah, so I mean,
are you working on anything now? Any books at the moment?
I'm working on a book that's actually about two things that came up here. Three things. It's about the modern time. So it's about capitalism and digital technology. That's part one. Part two and part three is about where that leaves us personally and socially in dealing with these things. So
I will be absolutely disappointed if the question concerning technology is not referenced somewhere in that book.
I mean, it's certainly in the background of a lot of it.
Okay, just for a listener, that's a essay, I think, that Heidegger.
Yeah, by Heidegger.
It's very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, I have not enough words to say thanks so much for all of your time, your energy, your brain power. But yeah, just absolutely wonderful conversation experience, which I greatly value. So I really appreciate you doing that, and it's been fabulous.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a real pleasure.
All right, thank you.